They ask me to begin at the end, because the end is the part that frightens them, and a frightened court is an honest one. So I will give them the end first. I will tell them what we did to the thing they sent, and I will not soften the shape of it, because softening is a courtesy, and I am fresh out of courtesies after what they put in front of us. We ate it. That is the sentence they want notarized into the record of 7 worlds. The being they bred in the dark for 9,000 of their years, the one they fed on the terror of 40 civilizations, the apex of every food chain they ever measured. We cooked it over a failing reactor vent and we ate it, and then we went looking for salt. There is a sound a room makes when 100 non-human jurists stop breathing at once. It is not silence. Silence is empty. This was the opposite of empty. This was a room filling up with the understanding that they had made a mistake so large it had a gravity of its own, and that I was the small heavy thing at the center of it, and that nothing they did now could pull me back out. I am Nadia Frost. I was the quartermaster of the survey vessel Ambrose Quill *, which is a polite way of saying I was the woman who decided who ate and who didn't when the numbers got mean. I have a degree in nutritional logistics and a second one in keeping my mouth shut, and I earned the second one the hard way, in places where saying the true thing out loud got people hurt. The Concord pulled me out of the wreck of my own life and stood me up in front of their highest assembly because I was the only one of us who would talk to them. The others wouldn't. Captain Amara wouldn't. Dr. Holt wouldn't. They had decided, in the way that survivors decide things without ever saying them aloud, that the Concord didn't deserve the story. I disagreed, not because the Concord deserved it, because I wanted it on the record forever, in a language that couldn't be edited, that when they reached down into the bottom of the universe to find a monster to break us with, they handed us a meal. The chamber they tried me in was grown, not built, a vast pale bowl of living coral stuff that flexed when the assembly murmured, so that disapproval moved through the walls like a tide. Above me hung the translation lattice, a constellation of small bright machines that took my words apart and rebuilt them in 9 tongues. I watched my sentences enter that lattice and come out changed, and I thought, this is exactly what they did to us. They took us apart expecting to find something simple. They rebuilt us in their own grammar, and they got the meaning wrong. The prosecutor was a tall, folded creature the color of old bruises, and the lattice gave its name to me as Vasari, speaker for the wronged worlds. It began the way they all began, with the catalogue of fear. It recited what the hush had done across the 40 civilizations, and the recitation took most of a day, and I will not pretend it was not terrible. Worlds emptied. Cities that woke one morning to find their populations had simply walked into the sea in the night, drawn out by a hunger that was not their own. The hush did not eat bodies first. It ate the will to keep them. It made you want to be eaten, and that wanting was the worst weapon anyone had ever pointed at a living mind. Vasari told all of it, and when it finished it turned the catalogue toward me like a blade, and asked the question the 7 worlds had grown this whole chamber to ask. How did your kind, soft and short-lived and barely off your own rock, do to our perfect terror what 40 older and wiser peoples could not? And I almost laughed, because the answer was so much smaller and uglier than the question. The answer was that the 40 older and wiser peoples had never been hungry. Not really, not the way we had been hungry. They had been afraid, and fear is a thing the hush was built to drink. But hunger, the long grinding humankind, the kind that has lived in our blood since before we had names for it, that the hush had never tasted, and it did not know what to do when it met a creature that looked at the apex predator of the universe and felt, underneath the terror, the oldest and most practical thought our species has ever had. That's a lot of meat. I did not say that part out loud. Not yet. You have to earn a sentence like that. You have to walk a courtroom all the way down into the dark with you before you can set it down and let them see what it really weighs. So I started where they told me to start, at the end, with the eating. And I worked backward from there, the way you trace a scar back to the wound, because that is the only honest way to tell a story about survival. You start with the proof that you lived, and then you make them sit with everything it cost. Let me give the court the kitchen, since the kitchen is what they cannot forgive. The Ambrose Quill was 11 days past the point where the food math stopped working. I want the assembly to understand that phrase, because they have never lived inside it. Food math is the quartermaster's whole religion. You take what you have and you divide it by the mouths and you multiply it by the days until resupply. And as long as that number stays above a certain line, the ship is a ship. When the number drops below the line, the ship becomes something else. It becomes a room full of animals who used to be friends, and the only thing standing between them and that truth is the person holding the calculator. That was me. I held the calculator. For 11 days the calculator had been lying to everyone, including me, and I had been letting it, because the truth was that we were going to start losing people to starvation in a matter of weeks, and there was nothing in the holds to stop it. And then the Concord's gift arrived, and the math changed. It came through the hull on the night cycle, and I will describe how it came, because the assembly has only ever heard the hush described by its victims, and victims describe the approach as the worst part. The approach is when you feel the wanting start. The walls of the quill began to breathe wrongness. Men who had not cried since childhood sat down in the corridors and wept with relief, because the hush was telling them in the language underneath language that the struggle was over, that they could stop now, that all they had to do was come and be unmade and it would feel like sleep. 3 of the crew were gone before we even understood what was happening, walked straight to the aft airlock, and cycled themselves out into the dark with smiles on their faces, drawn out by a peace that was not theirs to feel. I felt it too. I want that on the record. I am not a special creature, immune to the universe's worst weapon. I felt the hush reach into the back of my skull and stroke the place where the exhaustion lived, and offer to take it all away. 11 days of doing impossible arithmetic. 11 days of looking into the holds and knowing. The hush found that exhaustion and it pressed on it like a thumb on a bruise, and it said, in the voice that is not a voice, "You are so tired, little keeper of numbers, and I can make the numbers stop." What the hush did not know, what its makers never bothered to learn, is that for a starving creature, the offer of an end to hunger does not read as death. It reads as food. The hush reached into me and found the place where I was most desperate, expecting to find fear there, the way it had found fear in 40 civilizations. But the place where I was most desperate wasn't afraid. It was empty. It was a stomach. And when something dangles relief in front of an empty stomach, the stomach does not lie down. The stomach wakes up. I followed the wrongness, not toward the airlock, away from the others, toward the source, because some animal part of me had already done the math the calculator couldn't. Every other species the hush had met had run from the smell of it. We were the first that walked toward the smell of it, thinking, what is that, and can we use it? I found it in the reactor bay. It had come aboard to feed, and it had not finished, because the feeding had stopped working, because the ship was full of people too hungry to be properly afraid, and a confused apex predator is a slow apex predator. It was enormous, and it was beautiful in the way that deep-sea things are beautiful, all translucent muscle and slow light moving under a skin like wet glass, and it turned its great eyeless front toward me and pushed the wanting at me harder than it had pushed it at anyone, because I was the one resisting, and resistance to the hush is a kind of insult it had rarely suffered. And I stood in the doorway of the reactor bay, this small, tired woman with a calculator full of lies, and I looked at the most dangerous organism in the known universe, and the thought that rose up in me was not noble. It was not defiant. It was not the thought of a hero. It was the thought of every hungry ancestor I have ever had, going back to the first one who picked up a sharp rock and looked at something bigger than herself, and decided that bigger only meant more. I keyed the calm and I said the most human sentence ever spoken to a god of fear. I said, "Holt, get down to the reactor bay and bring the long knives. I think we found dinner." The lattice took that sentence apart, and the chamber convulsed. I had expected it. I had been saving the line. There is a cruelty in telling a courtroom of grieving species that the apex of their nightmares ended its career as a protein source, and I will admit I felt the cruelty and I did not regret it, because they had been cruel first, on a scale I could not match with 1,000 bad sentences. They had bred a thing to empty worlds and they had aimed it at mine, and now they wanted me to perform contrition. I would perform many things in that chamber. Contrition was not on the menu. Vossary, speaker for the wronged worlds, drew itself up out of its folds until it loomed over the witness floor, and it asked me whether I understood what I had consumed. Not an animal, it said. Not a beast. The hush that walks was the most refined instrument of fear ever achieved by living hands. It was a philosophy made flesh. It was the proof, 9,000 years in the perfecting, that all minds bow to terror if the terror is pure enough. And I had reduced that proof to a meal and a search for salt. "Yes," I said, "that is what happened. You have it exactly right." The chamber wanted me to flinch, and I would not give them the flinch. Instead, I asked Vossary a question, which a witness is not supposed to do, but I had decided early that I would not be a witness in the way they wanted. I would be the thing they had accidentally created when they sent their monster into my ship. I would be the consequence, standing up and talking back. I asked who fed it. The lattice carried the question into 9 tongues, and the chamber went still in a different way than before, because a philosophy made flesh does not feed itself. A thing bred over 9,000 years to drink the terror of the living has to be given the living, generation after generation, or it starves. The hush did not empty 40 civilizations by accident. Someone steered it. Someone opened the doors of 40 worlds and let it in and stood back and measured the result and wrote it down, and called the writing down a science, and called the science a defense, and slept well, because the things being emptied were always other things, lesser things prey. I knew the shape of that someone, because we have one of those someones too. Every people that has ever climbed to the top of anything has a quiet committee in a clean room deciding which lives are arithmetic. I have stood outside the doors of those rooms my whole career. The Concord's clean room was just bigger and older and had better funding, and the only real difference between their monster and the monsters my own kind has built is that theirs had teeth you could see. So when Vossary accused me of consuming a philosophy, I told the chamber the truth I had carried into it like a stone in my boot. I told them that we had not eaten their philosophy. We had eaten their excuse. The hush was the thing they pointed to when they wanted to call their cruelty natural. See, the universe makes monsters. Terror is the deep law. The strong feed on the frightened. It is simply how things are. We did not refute that argument with a speech. We refuted it with a reactor vent and a set of long knives. We took the deep law of the universe and we portioned it out among 14 hungry people, and the deep law tasted, Captain Amara said, a little like eel and a little like grief, and it kept us alive for 19 more days. I let that sit. Then I said the part that I think actually frightened them, more than the eating, more than the back talk. I said it was not even hard. To understand why it was not hard, the court has to walk back with me to before the reactor bay, before the wanting came through the hull, to the 11 empty days, and then back past those 2, to the day the Ambrose Quill stopped being a survey ship and started being bait. Because we were bait. I did not know it standing in that chamber on the first day, but I knew it by the end, and the court will know it before I am done, because the court was party to it whether the court admits it or not. The Quill was a deep survey vessel, 14 souls, sent out under a joint charter to map the dead zones along the Concord's frontier. The regions their own ships would not enter, the silent stretches where 40 civilizations had gone quiet. We were told it was scientific. We were told the silence was a natural phenomenon, some stellar effect that scrambled long-range contact, and that our small expendable human crew was perfect for the work because we were cheap and brave and far from home, which is a description that should have warned me and did not. Here is the thing about being from a young species in an old galaxy. You are grateful. You are so grateful to be invited to the table that you do not look closely at what is on the plates. The Concord had reached down to humanity a generation before I was born and offered us passage off our dying rock, offered us their roads between the stars, and in exchange, we did the work no one older wanted to do. We crewed the dangerous surveys. We mined the unstable belts. We were the labor that the comfortable civilizations had aged out of, and we told ourselves it was partnership because partnership is a nicer word than what it was. What it was a food chain. We just couldn't see our place on it yet. The dead zones were not a stellar effect. The dead zones were the hunting grounds. The Concord had been running the hush along its frontier for centuries, using it to keep the younger and more troublesome species thinned and frightened and dependent. And the silence we were sent to map was the silence of worlds that had been fed to it. They sent us in to map the feeding grounds because they wanted to know if the hush was still active in that sector. And the cleanest way to find out whether a predator is still hunting is to put something soft in the water and watch. We were the something soft. The Ambrose Quill was a baited hook with 14 people on it, and the people who lowered us into the dark knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it with the paperwork all in order and the charter co-signed, and a little ceremony before we launched where a Concord dignitary wished us a safe and fruitful journey in 9 tongues. I think about that ceremony more than almost anything else. The dignitary's good wishes. The way it meant them, probably, in the small local sense that one means such things, while the larger machinery it served had already written us off. That is how the worst things get done, not by monsters in reactor bays. By kind individuals serving cruel systems, each one passing the responsibility up the chain to a room they have never seen, until the cruelty has no author at all, just a long, polite chain of people who were only doing their small part, and wishing everyone a safe and fruitful journey. So when I tell the court it was not hard to eat their monster, I need them to understand the full weight of the asterisk it. It was not hard in the end, because by the time the hush came through our hull we had already been eaten. We had been digesting in the gut of their kindness for a generation. The reactor bay was just the first time the meal bit back. The court keeps a record of the dead. I am told, every name the hush ever took, carved into the living walls of 7 worlds. I want my 14 entered into that same record, because they earned a place in it more than most, and because the court should have to read their names beside the names of all the worlds its monster emptied, and feel how small 14 is, and feel how it was almost enough to balance the scale anyway. So the Ambrose Quill, Captain Amara Saul, who could go 3 days without sleep and not let it show in her hands, Dr. Alina Holt, ship's physician and the closest thing we had to a conscience, which she carried like a wound, Marcus Vey, pilot, who talked to the ship as if it could hear him and was right more often than not, the Akafer siblings, Daniel and Ruth, engineers, who fought constantly and would have each died for the other without a word, Old Prout, who had been doing deep survey since before the rest of us were born, and had the eyes of a man who had already seen how it ends. And the rest, Lena, Cho, Adebio, the twins from the agricultural deck, the boy Finch who was barely old enough to sign the charter, and me, 14. We were 30 days out from the frontier when the resupply failed to arrive at the rendezvous, and that is where the 11 empty days really begin, though we did not know it yet. A missed resupply is not a crisis. Ships are late. We tightened the rations a notch and we kept mapping, and Marcus told the ship it was being dramatic, and Holt made a joke about her waistline, and the food math still worked barely if you squinted. Then the second rendezvous failed. Then the long-range comm, which had been patchy in the dead zone, went fully dark, and Daniel Akafer spent 2 days inside the relay array and came out with grease to his elbows and a face I did not like, and he told Amara in the privacy of the galley, not knowing I was behind the store's partition doing inventory, that the array had not failed. It had been switched off, remotely, by a command authority that was not ours. I stood very still behind the partition with a tin of preserved protein in my hand, and I understood, in the cold, complete way you understand the important things, that no one was coming, that the silence was not an accident of the dead zone, that we had been switched off the way you switch off a light in a room you are done using. I did not tell the crew. That was my first real decision as the keeper of numbers, and I have turned it over 1,000 times since, and I still believe it was right, and I still hate that it was. If I had told them, the math would have collapsed instantly, because hope is the only thing that makes people accept a small ration, and the moment you take away the resupply, you take away the reason not to eat everything tonight. So I held the truth behind the partition with the tins, and I recalculated, and the new number was the meanest number I have ever produced. The new number said that with perfect discipline and no incidents, 14 people had food for 40 days, and after that they had each other. I want the court to sit with that, since it sat so comfortably with the breeding of the hush. 40 days and then each other. That was the gift the Concord's kindness had brought us to, weeks before its monster ever found our hull. The monster was almost a mercy when it came. The monster, at least, was honest about wanting to eat us. Vasari interrupted me here, in the telling, the way a prosecutor interrupts when the witness is building something the prosecution does not want built. It said that I was constructing a justification, that I was dressing a monstrous act in the robes of victimhood, that whatever the Concord's failings, nothing excused the consumption of a sentient being, and that my own people's hunger was a circumstance, not an absolution. And I agreed with it. That surprised the chamber. I said, "You are correct, Speaker. Hunger is not an absolution." I'm not standing here to be absolved. I gave up on absolution somewhere around the 4th empty day, when I caught myself calculating how much longer the rations would stretch if one of us stopped eating, and noticing that the math got easier with every name I subtracted, and understanding what kind of mind I was becoming. I am not innocent. None of us came out of that ship innocent, but you did not ask me here because you thought I was innocent. You asked me here because you cannot understand how we won, and you cannot understand how we won because the answer indicts you. And so I am going to keep building the thing you don't want built until you have no choice but to look at it. Let me tell the court about the discipline of hunger, since the court only understands the discipline of fear. The Concord built its whole frontier on a single idea, that terror is the deepest law, that every mind can be ruled by what it is afraid of, and that the species which masters fear masters the galaxy. 9,000 years they spent perfecting that idea in the body of the hush, and it is a true idea. I will not stand here and pretend fear is weak. Fear emptied 40 worlds. Fear is the oldest king there is. But it is not the oldest. There is one older. Before anything that crawled or swam or flew was ever afraid, it was hungry. Hunger is older than fear because hunger comes first. You have to want to keep living before you can be afraid of dying. Fear is just hunger's bodyguard. And what the Concord never learned in all its 9,000 years of refining terror is that if you push a creature past fear, if you starve it long enough that the fear burns off like fog, what you find underneath is not surrender. What you find underneath is the original engine, the wanting, the thing that looks at the whole hostile universe and says, mine, if I can reach it. We are a hungry species. The court should write that down as the central finding of these proceedings. Not cruel though we can be, not brave though we manage it sometimes. Hungry. We evolved on a world that was always running short of something, and we have spent our entire history figuring out how to eat the things that were trying to eat us. The Concord looked at humanity and saw soft, short-lived, cheap labor, far from home. It did not see the hunger because the hunger only shows itself at the bottom in the dark, when the fear is gone and there is nothing left but the wanting and a sharp enough tool. The hush went looking for our fear. the way it had found everyone's fear. And it found it. We were afraid. But our fear was not at the bottom of us. Underneath our fear was 11 days of starvation and 400,000 years of ancestors who had been starving and refusing to lie down about it. And the hush put its weapon into that, and the weapon went off in its own hand. The court has been patient with my circling, so let me reward the patience with the part of the story I have told no one, not even the others, because the others were inside it with me and do not need telling. Let me give the court the middle of the starving, the long flat stretch between the day the resupply failed and the night the hush came, because that is where we became the people who could do what we did, and the court cannot judge the act without first sitting in the days that forged the actors. Hunger is not dramatic. That is the first thing the comfortable never understand. They imagine starvation as a steep cliff, a sudden fall, a clean crisis. It is not. It is a slope so gentle you cannot feel yourself descending it. The body is patient and clever, and it gives up its reserves in a careful order, hoarding the brain for last, so that the mind stays sharp enough to watch itself be dismantled. For the first week you are merely hungry, the ordinary hunger anyone knows. For the second week the hunger becomes a presence, a passenger, a thing that sits behind your eyes and colors everything. By the third week the hunger is no longer something you have. It is something you are. You do not feel hungry anymore, the way a fish does not feel wet. You have become a hunger that happens to be shaped like a person, walking around a ship, doing tasks, pretending. I watched it take my crew, one careful gram at a time. Marcus Vey, who talked to the ship, the hunger took his words first, not because his body needed them but because talking costs something, and the body in its terrible economy stops paying for anything it does not strictly need. He went quiet the way a radio goes quiet when the power fails, not all at once, just fewer and fewer words until one day there were none. The Akafir siblings stopped fighting for the same reason. Conflict is expensive. The body defunds it. By the third week, Daniel and Ruth moved around each other in a silence that had nothing to do with peace, and everything to do with the fact that neither of them could any longer afford the energy to care out loud. Holt I watched most closely, because Holt was watching all of us, and a watcher who stops watching is the first sign that a ship is dying. She kept the medical logs in a hand that grew smaller and more careful as the weeks went on, the letters shrinking as her body shrank, and she came to me on the 19th day of the empty stretch, 19, the same number that the hush would later feed us, a symmetry I have never been able to stop noticing. And she told me, very quietly in the stores where only I would hear, that we were past the point where everyone would survive even if resupply came that very hour. The damage was done. Some of us had crossed a line inside our own cells that could not be uncrossed by a late meal. She did not say which of us. She did not know yet. But she wanted one other person to carry the knowledge with her, because it was too heavy to carry alone, and she had chosen me, the keeper of numbers, because I was the one person on the ship whose whole job was carrying numbers too heavy to say out loud. That was the real beginning of what we became, not the reactor bay. That conversation in the stores, two starving women agreeing without words to hold a truth that would break the others, agreeing to keep doing the math and keep our faces still and keep the ship a ship for as long as our arithmetic could lie convincingly. We were already, by the 19th empty day, the kind of people who could portion out a life to save the rest. The hush did not make us into that. The Concord switched off calm, and the empty holds made us into that, slowly, gently, one defunded word and unfought fight at a time. And the monster only arrived at the very end to discover that the soft, cheap, expendable humans it had been sent to frighten had already been forged by hunger into the one thing in the universe it could not eat. The court has heard that I learned the truth about the calm from behind the store's partition, overhearing Daniel tell Amara that the array had been switched off remotely by an authority that was not ours. I told it quickly, the way I tell the things that are too heavy to dwell in. But that moment was the true beginning of everything I became, more than the reactor bay, more even than the warm galley the night before, and the court should have it slowly, because it is the moment a keeper of numbers learned what numbers can be made to do, and what they cost the one who keeps them. I was doing inventory. That is the small, ordinary fact that places me behind the partition. Not eavesdropping, not lurking, just counting tins in the half-dark of the stores because counting was my job, and the job did not stop for bad news. I had a tin of preserved protein in my hand. I remember its exact weight, the way you remember the irrelevant physical facts of the moments that break you. And on the other side of the thin partition, Daniel Acaffer came in with grease to his elbows, and the kind of voice a man uses when he has carried a thing as far as he can alone and has to set it down on someone. And he set it down on Amara, not knowing I was 3 feet away with a tin in my hand. The array had not failed. It had been commanded dark, by an authority that was not ours, on a schedule. And I stood there, and I did the thing I have done my whole life, the thing that is my gift and my curse, and the reason I am the last entry in my own ledger. I did the math. Instantly, without choosing to, the way you flinch from heat, I did the math of what that fact meant, and the math was complete before Daniel had finished his sentence. No resupply, because the resupply was never coming, because we were not a posting that anyone intended to retrieve. Calm dark on a schedule, because a clean result requires no contaminating rescue. 14 people in a dead zone that 40 civilizations had gone silent in. The math resolved all of it, in the time it took to hold 1 tin of protein, and the answer was, we are bait, and no one is coming, and the only question left is how the dying goes. And here is the thing I have never told anyone, not Amara, not Holt, not the court until this moment. In the instant the math resolved, before grief, before fear, before any of the human things arrived, I felt something else, something I have been ashamed of for the rest of my life. I felt the problem become interesting. The keeper of numbers, confronted with the meanest arithmetic of her life, felt the cold, clean part of herself lean forward with something almost like appetite and think, all right. 14 people, finite food, no resupply, maximum survival time. Solve it. That part of me did not panic. That part of me reached for the calculator with something that was nearly relief, because a clear problem is a kind of mercy to a mind built to solve them, even when the problem is the deaths of your friends. That is the clean room, the court should understand. That is the committee, living inside me. The capacity to feel a catastrophe become an interesting problem, to meet the worst news of your life with the cold lean forward of competence. That is not a flaw in the system that empties worlds. That is the system. The clean rooms are not staffed by monsters. They are staffed by people like me, people who are very, very good at the math, who feel the problem become interesting before they feel the people become real, and who are then handed enough comfort and enough distance that the people never quite become real at all. And the arithmetic just runs, and the world's empty, and everyone wishes everyone a safe and fruitful journey. The only thing that saved me from being that, the only thing is that I was 3 feet away from the people, with a tin of their food in my hand, and I could not get the distance. The math became interesting, and then, half a second later, the people became real, more real than they had ever been. Finch laughing with his head on the table the night before, and the two things collided in me and have never stopped colliding. That collision is who I am. That collision is the whole human animal, I think. The cold competence and the warm, unbearable particularity slammed together with no distance to keep them apart. And the Concord's great mistake, its 9,000-year error, was building an empire that ran on keeping them apart, on distance, on clean rooms, on never standing 3 feet from the meat with a tin in your hand. We won because we could not get the distance. We have never been able to get the distance. It is the worst thing about being us, and it is the only thing that has ever saved us. And I felt it arrive, complete, behind a store's partition, with a tin of protein in my hand and my whole crew's death resolving like a solved equation in the cold, clean front of my mind. The court has heard the large beats of the empty days, the failed resupply, the dark calm, the cut rations, the slow erosion. But survival is not made of large beats. Survival is made of small rituals, tiny stupid human things that have no logical right to matter and that turn out at the bottom to be the only things that do. And I want the court to have a few of ours, because they are the reason 9 of us were still standing, still sane, still ourselves enough to walk down to a reactor bay when the wanting finally came. We kept eating together. That was the first ritual and the most important, and it was Imara's doing. When the rations were cut, the easy thing, the efficient thing, would have been to let people take their portions and eat alone on their shifts wherever. That is what a ship of individuals does. But Imara understood something that no efficiency expert in any clean room has ever understood, which is that a crew that eats alone is already dying, no matter how the food math looks. So she held the line on the shared meal even as the meal shrank to almost nothing. We sat together every night cycle around a table that held less and less, and we ate our pitiful portions slowly together, and we talked, or did not talk, but we were together. And the togetherness was a nutrient that did not show up in any of my calculations, and that kept us alive past the point where the calculations said we should have started to come apart. We told the stories on a rotation. That was Cho's ritual before the airlock took him. He noticed, somewhere in the second week, that we were running out of things to say, that hunger was eating our conversation the way it ate everything else. And so he instituted, with the mock formality that was his particular humor, a rotation each night. One of us had to tell the others something true that none of them knew. A memory, a secret, a small confession. It cost us something to do it in a currency more precious than calories, and that was the point. It was Cho's way of making us spend ourselves on each other, of keeping us real to one another even as our bodies tried to retreat into private survival. I learned things about my crew in those nights that I would never otherwise have known, the small true interior things people carry and rarely set down, and I have kept every one of them. And when I memorize the good nights now, I am partly doing what Cho taught us, spending myself on the dead so they stay real. Holt sang. Not well, Holt would want the court to know she sang badly. She was insistent about it in life, and I will be faithful to her in the record. She had a low, rough voice and no gift for melody, and she sang anyway, in the night cycles, old songs from a world none of us had ever seen, the songs her grandmother had sung, and the badness of the singing was somehow the comfort of it, because a beautiful voice would have been a performance and Holt's rough one was just a human being making sound into the dark to say, I am still here. We are still here. The dark has not won yet. I cannot hear those songs now without coming apart, the few I remember. They are the sound of the worst month of my life, and also the sound of being kept alive by people who loved me, and those two things will never separate, and I no longer want them to. And we touched each other more. That is the last ritual and the hardest to explain to a court of folded and shelled and many-limbed beings who may not share the particular human fact of it, but I will try, because it matters. As the hunger deepened, we became, without deciding to, a more physical crew, a hand on a shoulder passing in the corridor, sitting closer than we needed to. The Akafir siblings, who had fought for years, took to sleeping in the same compartment near the end, back to back, the way they must have as small children before the world taught them to fight. We were starving, and the body that is starving craves warmth, and the deepest warmth there is, the oldest, older than fire, is the warmth of another body that has agreed to be near you in the dark. We pressed together against the cold and the hunger and the wanting that had not yet come, but that some animal part of us already felt approaching, and the pressing together was the most human thing we did, the thing that 14 became 9 of us carried down into the reactor bay, the warmth of each other, the refusal to face the dark alone. The hush offered each of us a private door. We had spent 30 days making ourselves unable to walk through any door privately, because we had made ourselves into one warm thing in the cold, and one warm thing does not fit through a door built for one. There was a question on the second day that I have not yet given the court, because it is the one that cost me the most to answer, and I have been protecting myself from it the way I protected my crew from the truth about the calm. But the record should be whole, and a whole record does not get to omit the witness's deepest wound. So I will set it down now here in the middle, where it belongs, because it happened in the middle of me and has stayed there. One of the assembly, not Vasari, one of the quieter jurists, a small gray folded thing that had said nothing in 2 days, asked me, in a voice the lattice rendered almost gently, whether I had chosen. Whether, in all my talk of arithmetic and portioning and the cold, clean competence that kept my crew alive, there had been a moment when I decided who lived. Whether the keeper of numbers had, at any point, done the thing that the clean rooms do, and looked at her crew and sorted them, this one and not that one, saved and spent. And I wanted to say no. The whole architecture of my defense, 3 days of it, leaned on the difference between us and the committees, that we could not get the distance, that we stayed close enough to the meat to weep, that our hunger was honest and theirs was upholstered. A clean asterisk no would have protected all of that. And it would have been a lie, and the small gray jurist had asked the question in a way that told me it already knew, the way Holt knew which parts of the hush would feed us and which would kill us, the way the truly perceptive always know the thing you are most defending yourself against. So I said yes. There was a night, around the 24th day of the empty stretch, when one of the crew, I will not give the name belongs to a living person who came home and does not need it carried in this record, fell ill in a way that Holt told me privately in the stores was likely fatal regardless of food. The body had crossed a line. And I sat that night with my calculator, and I did the math that the clean rooms do, the math I have spent my whole life since refusing to have done. And the math said that the rations spent keeping that one comfortable were rations subtracted from the survival of the rest, and that the kindest and most efficient and most monstrous thing would be to let the dying go and feed the living. And I ran that math, all of it, to the end, and I saw the number it produced, and the number was a person. I did not do it. I want the court to hear both halves of this, because both halves are true and neither cancels the other. I ran the math fully, the way the committee runs it, and then I closed the calculator, and I went and sat with the sick crew member through the night, and I gave them my own portion the next day, and I told no one, and they did not die. The line Holt feared had not quite been crossed after all, and they came home. I ran the clean room's math, and then I refused its answer with my own body, and I have never known in all the years since, whether that makes me better than the committee or just luckier, whether the difference between a survivor and a monster is really the weeping or whether it is only that my math, that one night, turned out to be wrong, and I could afford to be merciful because the mercy did not cost me the crew. That is the wound, that is the thing under the thing. I have stood in this chamber for 3 days drawing a clean line between us and the clean rooms, and the truth is that the line runs through me, that I contain both, that the same night I held a sick crew member's hand I had already, an hour before, calculated their death and found it sound. The only thing I can say for myself, the only thing, is that I made myself sit on the side of the line where you do the math and then refuse it, where you stay close enough to weep, where you give your own portion rather than spend someone else's life, and that I have kept making myself sit there every day for the rest of my life, because it is a choice that has to be made again every single day and never stays made. The committee is always there, inside the competence, running its sound and monstrous numbers. Civilization, the real kind, the kind worth the name, is not being free of it. It is refusing it daily, forever, with your own body, while weeping, and never once getting to believe you have refused it for good. But I am ahead of myself, telling the court the meaning before I have told them the night, and a meaning without its night is just a sermon. The court has had enough sermons from enough species. Let me give them the night the hush came aboard, the way it actually happened, in the order it actually happened, which is the only part of this whole testimony I have been telling in order, because some things you cannot tell backward. Some things only make sense as they fall. It was day 29 of the empty stretch. The ration had been cut to a level that the medical literature calls survivable and the body calls a slow argument it is losing. We had not lost anyone yet. That was Holt's doing and mine, her keeping the bodies going, me keeping the numbers from showing on my face. The crew had thinned. Marcus had stopped talking to the ship. The Akafir siblings had stopped fighting, which was worse than the fighting. Finch, the boy, had taken to sleeping in the galley, near the smell of food, the way a child sleeps near a parent's door. The wanting came through the hull at the start of the night cycle, and at first we thought it was a gas leak, because that is what peace feels like when you have forgotten it. It feels like something has gone wrong with the air. A great soft warmth moved through the Quill asterisk, and the exhaustion that every one of us had been carrying for 29 days simply lifted, and in its place came the most beautiful idea any of us had heard in a month. The idea was, you can stop now. I have tried many times to describe the Hush's weapon to people who were not there, and the closest I have come is this. Imagine the most tired you have ever been. Now imagine a voice you trust completely, a voice with no agenda you can detect, telling you that you are allowed to set the weight down, that you have done enough, that the struggle is finished and no one will blame you, and that all you have to do to make it true is walk to a particular door and step through. That is the Hush. It does not frighten you to death. It relieves you to death. It finds the exact place where your strength has run out, and it tells you that running out is permitted. And for a creature at the end of its strength, that permission is the sweetest thing in the universe. Cho went first. We found the airlock log afterward. He cycled it at the very start of the night, calm as a man going to bed, and the dark took him. Then a Debyo. Then one of the agricultural twins, and her brother went after her not because the Hush called him, but because he could not bear the door she had gone through, and that is its own kind of being eaten, the kind we do to ourselves out of love. Four of my 14, gone before the rest of us were even fully awake to what was happening, and the ship filling up with that terrible warm permission, that gentle insistence that the only sane thing left to do was come and be unmade. And here is the thing the court needs to hear about that night, the thing that I think is the truest thing I know about my own species. As the Hush poured its mercy through our ship, as 4 of us walked smiling into the dark, the rest of us got angry, not afraid. We were afraid too, the fear was there, but on top of the fear, hotter than the fear, was a fury that I can only call ancestral. Something was taking our people. Something was in our house, reaching into our crew and pulling them out one by one with a lie about peace. And the oldest part of every human heart, the part that kept a fire burning at the mouth of a cave for 100,000 years against everything in the dark that wanted in, that part woke up, and it did not want to be saved, and it did not want to lie down. It wanted to find whatever was doing this and make it stop. I told the court earlier, quickly, that 4 of us walked into the airlocks before the rest woke fully. I told it quickly on purpose, because there are things you can only say quickly the first time or you cannot say them at all. But the court has earned the slow version now, and the 4 who left have earned it more, because in the quick telling they are only a number subtracted, and they were people, and the manner of their leaving is the truest portrait of the Hush's weapon that I or anyone will ever be able to give. Cho went first, and Cho is the one I think about most because Cho was the strongest of us. Not physically, Cho was a slight man, a systems analyst, soft-spoken. But Cho had a steadiness the rest of us leaned on without admitting it, a calm that had held through the failed resupply and the dead calm and the shrinking rations, the kind of calm that makes a crew feel that someone, at least, is not afraid. And the Hush took him first precisely because of that calm, because the Hush does not hunt the weak the way a lion hunts the weak. The Hush hunts the tired, and the strong are the most tired of all, because the strong are the ones who have been carrying everyone else. Cho had been holding the rest of us up for 30 days, and when the wanting came through the hull and told him he could set the weight down, his strength was exactly what made the offer irresistible. He had more weight to set down than anyone. He cycled the airlock the way he did everything, calmly, neatly, without fuss, and the log shows he paused for 9 seconds in the chamber before the outer door opened. And I have spent years wondering what those 9 seconds were, and I have decided to believe they were Cho being Cho one last time, checking the systems, making sure the door would work, taking care of us even in the act of leaving us. Adebyo went second, and Adebyo went angry, which is the only mercy in the whole account, because Adebyo at least did not go smiling. We found her console still active. In the last moments before the wanting took her fully, she had been trying to fight it, trying to log what was happening, and the log breaks off mid-sentence, and the sentence is it is in the air it is telling us to, and then nothing because the telling one. But she fought. I hold on to that. One of my 4 fought the unfightable thing all the way to the door, and lost, and her losing is not a stain on her. It is the bravest thing in the whole record, braver than the reactor bay. Because in the reactor bay we had each other, and Adebyo had only herself and the lie in her own head, and she called it a lie right up until the end. The agricultural twins went last of the 4, and they went together, and theirs is the one I cannot tell the court without stopping. The sister went first, drawn out by the hush like the others, and her brother, the hush had not taken him yet, his mind was still his own. Her brother followed her into the dark anyway, not because the weapon called him, because he woke and saw the airlock cycling and understood that his sister was on the other side of it and could not bear a universe with her gone from it, and chose. The hush did not eat him. Love did. He walked into the airlock with his eyes clear, knowing exactly what it was, choosing the dark over a life without her in it. And that is the one death aboard the Quill that the hush cannot claim, and I enter it into the court's record specifically to deny the monster that one. You took 3, I tell the record. The 4th was never yours. The 4th was his own, given freely, for love, in the one act of that whole terrible night that nothing in the universe gets to call prey. Captain Amara Saul found me in the corridor outside the stores, where I had braced myself against the wanting by gripping the door handle until my knuckles split, because pain was the one thing the hush could not make feel like peace. She had a wound on her arm she had given herself for the same reason. We did not speak about it. We have a whole unspoken language, my species, for the moments when we are each privately holding the line and need to know the other one is holding it too. She looked at my bleeding hand, and I looked at her bleeding arm, and something passed between us that meant asterisk still here then, and that was enough. What was left of the crew gathered in the galley, because that is where Finch was, and no one wanted to leave the boy alone with the door voice in his head. 9 of us, where there had been 14. Imara did not give a speech. Imara was not a speech kind of captain. She put a ration bar in the center of the table. One of the last, I knew the exact count. I always knew the exact count. And she said that whatever was aboard had come into our house to take us, and that she for one had not survived this far to walk smiling into an airlock for the convenience of something in the reactor bay, and that she intended to go down there and look it in the eye and tell it no, and that anyone who wanted to come could come. And anyone who needed to stay and hold the line in their own head could stay. And there was no shame in either, but the bar in the center of the table was for whoever was still standing at the end, because by God somebody was going to be standing at the end. It was the ration bar that did it, not the courage, the ration bar. Because the moment she put it down, every starving animal in that room understood that she was promising us a future with eating in it. And a future with eating in it was the one thing none of us had been able to imagine for 29 days. And the hush had been winning precisely because it had nothing to offer but an end, and Amara had just offered a beginning, small and bitter and bar-shaped, but a beginning. We went down to the reactor bay in a loose, terrible procession, gripping pain to keep our heads clear. Holt had a scalpel and used the flat of it against her own wrist when the wanting surged, and passed the technique down the line, So we went into the dark, leaving a little trail of our own blood like a thread back out. Daniel Acaffer brought the cutting tools from engineering, the long plasma knives we used for hull work, because they were the closest thing the Quill had to weapons, and because some part of Daniel had already arrived where I had arrived, in the doorway, looking at the size of the thing and thinking more. The hush felt us coming, and it did not understand us. I know this now from what came after, from the way the Chamber's own records describe its previous hunts, but I felt it even then. It had expected the procession to be drawn toward it, smiling, surrendering. Instead, here came 9 bleeding humans, furious and starving, walking into the worst weapon in the universe on purpose, getting stronger as they got closer because proximity to the threat was burning the last fog of fear off the hunger underneath. The hush pushed harder. It opened itself all the way up and poured everything it had into us, the full 9,000-year refinement of terror and relief, the weapon that emptied 40 worlds. And it found at the bottom of 9 human beings no fear left to drink, only the wanting, only the fire at the mouth of the cave. Only 400,000 years of ancestors looking up at something bigger and deciding together, in one voice older than language. That is a great deal of meat, and we are so very hungry, and there are 9 of us and 1 of it. The court has the shape of the descent already, 9 of us, bleeding to keep clear, going down to the reactor bay. But the descent deserves its full length, because it was the longest walk of any of our lives, and because what happened in that corridor is the thing I most want 7 worlds to understand about how fear is actually beaten, since the Concord spent 9,000 years studying how it is caused, and never once studied how it is survived. It is 40 meters from the galley to the reactor bay, 40 meters. On an ordinary day, you walk it in under a minute without thinking. That night it took us the better part of an hour, because every meter the wanting grew stronger, and every meter we had to stop and remember, individually, in the privacy of our own failing minds, why we were walking toward the thing that every instinct screamed at us to walk away from. 40 meters of the universe's worst weapon turned up to its maximum, poured into 9 starving people, and we crossed it at the pace of the dying, one deliberate step at a time. Holt's technique held us together. The blood thread, we came to call it afterward on the 19 days home, when we could bear to name it. The hush's weapon worked by finding the place where your strength had run out and offering to end the strain, and Holt had understood, in her clinical way, that physical pain was the one signal the body could not reinterpret as peace. So we went down that corridor hurting ourselves in a careful relay, a press of the scalpel, a bitten lip, knuckles ground against the bulkhead, each fresh hurt buying a few more meters of clear mind before the wanting closed back in. We left a thread of our own blood down 40 meters of corridor, a literal line we were drawing through the dark, and the line said, "We were here, we did not lie down, follow the blood back out if any of us live to follow it." Finch should not have been with us. He was the youngest, barely on the charter, and Amara had ordered him to stay in the galley, and he had refused, and his refusal is a thing I have thought about for years. He said one of the few things anyone said in that whole descent. He said that he was not going to sit in the galley alone with the voice in his head, that the voice was worse alone, that he would rather hurt and walk with us than be peaceful and wait. And Amara looked at him for a long moment and then handed him a length of cable to grip and a place in the line, because she understood what he was telling her. The hush is worse alone. Its mercy is a solitary thing, a private door it opens just for you. Together, hurting, bleeding, furious, we could resist it. Alone in the galley with no one to bleed beside, Finch would have walked into an airlock by the second hour, and he knew it, and he chose the corridor. And that choice is the reason he came home, even though what came home was no longer a boy. We reached the reactor bay door, the 9 of us, trailing our blood thread, and we stopped, because the wanting at the threshold was a wall. The hush was just beyond the door, and it had felt us coming for 40 meters, and it had thrown everything it had against us, and we had come anyway, And now we stood at the door and it poured the last of itself through, and I felt every one of us waver. I felt the offer in my own skull, so close now to the source that it was almost unbearable, the promise of an end to 30 days of arithmetic. And I knew that some of us were not going to be able to cross that threshold, that the door was a line some of us could not pass. And it was Amara who got us through, and she did it not with courage but with hunger, which is the whole lesson of this testimony in a single moment. She did not say be brave. She did not say for the crew or for humanity or any of the words that the comfortable imagine are said at such thresholds. She turned to the 8 of us bleeding behind her, with the wanting screaming through all our heads, and she said, in a flat, starving voice, the truest thing anyone said that whole night. I'm hungry. And it's right there, let's go. And we went. The court has heard the hush described 40 times by 40 peoples, and every one of them describes the same thing. The approach, the wanting, the surrender, and then nothing, because there was no one left to describe the rest. I am the first witness in 9,000 years to describe the rest. The court should understand what a strange and lonely thing that makes me. I am the only living mind that has watched the hush that walks be afraid. Because it was afraid at the end, I felt it. The thing that had never in 9,000 years met a prey that did not flee, that did not surrender, that did not lie down, that thing met 9 of us in the reactor bay. And for the first time in its long, terrible life, the weapon it pointed at us came back empty. And underneath its own perfect predator calm, something moved that it had never felt before and did not have a name for, because its makers had bred it to cause that feeling and had carefully, deliberately, never given it the capacity to feel it. They built a thing to make others afraid, and they made it incapable of fear, because a fearful weapon is unreliable. And so when fear finally came for the hush, it came into a mind with no defenses against it at all, no discipline, no 400,000 years of keeping a fire lit against the dark. It came into the hush the way the hush had come into 40 worlds, total and sudden, and impossible to set down. The apex predator of the universe met its first apex predator, and we were starving, and it had never learned how to be prey. I will not give the court a butcher's account. They want one, I think, the part of grief that is also appetite wants to hear the monster suffer, and I will not feed that part, because I have spent enough of this testimony refusing to be what they wanted. I will say only this. It was fast. We were many and it was one, and it was confused and we were not. Daniel and Ruth Ackafer went in low with the plasma knives, the way you take down anything large, at the legs that were not quite legs, and Amara went for the front of it where the weapon mind lived, and the rest of us did what hungry pack animals have done since the first hunt, which is to be everywhere at once and give the big thing nowhere to turn. It tried the weapon one last time. It poured surrender into us. And we ate the surrender like we intended to eat the rest of it, and we kept coming. When it was over, the reactor bay was very quiet, and 9 exhausted people stood around the stilled body of the most dangerous organism the universe had ever produced, and there was a silence among us that I have never been able to fully describe. It was not triumph. We were too tired and too far past ourselves for triumph. It was something closer to the silence in a kitchen after the hard part of the cooking is done, and the thing is finally on the fire and you realize, for the first time in a long time, that you are going to get to eat. And then Prout, old Prout who had seen how everything ends, leaned on a plasma knife and looked at the mountain of stilled translucent muscle, all that beautiful deep-sea light gone still under the skin like glass, and he said the thing that I have carried with me into every chamber and every nightmare since. He looked at the apex of the universe lying dead at our feet, killed by hungry primates with hull-cutting tools, and he said, quietly, almost gently, "Well, waste not." I gave the court a merciful version of the kill earlier, and I stand by the mercy, because a butcher's account would have fed the wrong appetite in that chamber. But there is one part of those minutes I withheld even from the merciful version, and I have decided the record needs it, because it is the part that has lived in me longest and changed me deepest, and because It is the only moment in this entire account where I felt something pass between my species and theirs that was not predator and prey. When we crossed the threshold, the hush stopped pushing the wanting at us. It happened all at once, like a held breath released. For 30 seconds, maybe less, the weapon simply switched off, and the silence where it had been was the loudest thing I have ever heard. And in that silence, I understood that the hush had realized, in whatever passed for its mind, that the weapon was not working, that it had spent its entire arsenal on us, and we had walked through it bleeding and furious, and that for the first time in 9,000 years, the thing it was facing was not going to be made afraid. And so it stopped trying to make us afraid, and in the absence of that effort, something else became possible, something the hush had never had room for because it had always been busy being terrible. It looked at us. I do not mean it turned its eyeless front toward us, though it did. I mean that for those 30 seconds, with the weapon down, the hush and the 9 of us simply regarded one another across the reactor bay as what we actually were. 10 starving creatures at the bottom of themselves, in the dark, at the end of everything, each of us the last of our kind in that emptied sector, each of us having come too far and lost too much to be anything but exactly what we were. And in that regard I felt, and I will swear this to the court on whatever the court holds sacred, I felt the hush understand us. Not forgive, not surrender, understand. It felt our hunger, because it was a thing that fed on the inside of minds, and it could not help but feel what was loudest in ours. And what was loudest in ours was not fear and not hatred, but the same desperate wanting that was loudest in it. For 30 seconds, 2 starving species recognized the hunger in each other, and it was the closest thing to communion the universe had ever allowed between us. And then the 30 seconds ended, because communion does not feed 9 people, and we were 9 and it was 1, and we were so very hungry. I want the court to understand that we did not kill it in hatred. That is the thing I most need entered into the record. There was no hatred in that reactor bay. Hatred is a luxury of the Fed. We killed it the way the first humans killed the mammoth and the cave bear, and every great dangerous thing that stood between our ancestors and another sunrise. Not with hatred, with need, with a terrible focused tenderness that is the truest face of survival. Holt was already weeping before the first cut, weeping for the thing we were about to do, and she did it anyway, and the weeping and the doing were not in conflict. They were the same act. They were what it looks like when a creature with a conscience does the unforgivable necessary thing and refuses to lie to itself about either half of it. And at the very end, when it was nearly done, when the great translucent body was stilling and the deep-sea light under its skin was going dark, the hush did the thing that I have never been able to stop seeing. It reached out one last time into our minds, not with the weapon. The weapon was spent, and it pushed toward us with the last of itself, the only thing it had left to give. It pushed peace. Real peace this time, not the weaponized kind. It was, I think, the only kindness it had ever been allowed to perform in 9,000 years of being a weapon, and it spent it on us, on the things that were killing it, in its final moment. And I have never decided whether it was forgiving us or thanking us or simply, at the last, no longer able to tell the difference between the two, the way I can no longer tell the difference between surviving and becoming a monster, the way perhaps no starving thing ever can. The court wants to know about the eating, so I will stop circling it and set it down on the floor of the chamber between us, where everyone can see it. We did not eat it the way the catalog of horror imagines, all teeth and triumph. We were a survey crew, not savages, whatever the Concord's records will say of us when these proceedings are sealed. We did it the way humans have always processed the large, dangerous thing they have killed, which is carefully, and with a strange reverence that lives right next to the hunger and does not cancel it out. Daniel and Ruth, who knew the ship systems, rigged the reactor vent into a heat source. Holt, who knew bodies, made the cuts, because she was the only one of us qualified to tell which parts of an unknown organism would feed us and which would kill us, and she did it weeping the entire time, and no one told her to stop weeping because the weeping was correct. We were not proud. We were not ashamed either. We were both at once, the way you can only be both at the bottom of something. I portioned it. That was my job, and I did my job. I stood over the body of the universe's apex predator with my calculator that had been lying to everyone for 30 days, and for the first time in a month the calculator told the truth, and the truth was a number going up instead of down. There was enough. After 30 days of a number that only fell, there was suddenly enough and more than enough, and I remember the exact moment the new number resolved on the screen because it was the moment I started shaking and could not stop. 9 people, weeks of food. The math, for the first time since the resupply failed, said live. Captain Amara made everyone eat together. She was very firm about that. She said that if we were going to do this thing, we were going to do it as a crew, at a table like people, and not alone in corners like animals ashamed of their own survival. So we sat, the 9 of us, in the galley where Finch had been sleeping near the smell of food, and we ate the hush that walks, and I will tell the court what it was like, because they have grown a whole chamber to ask, and they deserve an answer even if they will hate it. It was good. God forgive us, it was good. After 30 days of nothing it would have been good if it had tasted like ash, but it did not taste like ash. Amara said it was a little like eel. Holt could not say anything because Holt was still weeping, but she ate. We all ate, even Finch, especially Finch, the boy putting weight back on his own bones one careful bite at a time. And somewhere in the middle of that meal the shaking stopped, and the color came back into faces that had been gray for a month, and Marcus Vey, who had not spoken to the ship in 2 weeks, looked up from his plate and said, to no one, to the ship, thank you. And I do not know to this day whether he was thanking the Quill or the thing we were eating or whatever it is that lets the starving find food, and I do not think it matters. The thanks was real. That is the part the court cannot forgive and the part I will defend with my last breath. There was gratitude in that galley. We were grateful. We had been given our lives back, and it did not matter that the giver was the same hand that had taken them. Did not matter that the mercy and the cruelty came wrapped in the same translucent skin. We were alive, and we were grateful to be alive, and we said so out loud over the body of the thing that was sent to kill us. And if that is monstrous, then the court will have to explain to me what exactly it expected 9 starving people to feel. I have told the court about the meal, the galley, the gratitude that it cannot forgive. But I told it from inside myself, from the quartermaster's place, and there is one angle on that meal that I have never given to anyone, and I give it now because it is the truest small thing I know about what we paid, and because it belongs to Finch, and Finch can no longer give it himself, not because he is dead, he is alive, he teaches, he carries, but because some things a person lives through cannot be spoken by the one who lived them, and have to be carried out into the record by a witness who loved them. So I will be Finch's witness, the way the archivist was the 40 world's witness, the way I have tried to be everyone's witness in this long telling. Finch did not want to eat, that is the thing. When the meal was ready and Amara gathered us to the table, the boy, 16, starving, his body screaming for exactly what was in front of him, Finch sat down and looked at the food and could not lift his hand. The rest of us were already eating, weeping or not weeping, but eating, the bodies overriding everything, and Finch sat with his hands in his lap and tears running down a face that was still, for one more minute, a child's face, and he could not make himself begin. Because Finch had understood, faster than the rest of us, what the food was. We had all understood intellectually. Finch had understood it in the place where you cannot lie to yourself, and he sat there, 16 years old and dying, unable to eat the thing that would save him because to eat it was to become someone who had eaten it. And the boy knew, the way the young sometimes know the enormous things with terrible clarity, that the bite he was about to take was the bite that would end his childhood. And he did not want to take it, not because he wanted to die, but because he did not want to stop being a boy, and those were. That night the same choice. It was Prout who reached him. Of course it was. Old Prout, who had seen how it ends, sat down next to the boy, not across next to clothes, the way we had all learned to sit in the empty days, and he did not tell Finch to eat. He did not say it would be all right. He said one thing quietly, just for the boy, though I was close enough to hear, and it is the wisest thing I have ever heard one human being say to another, and I have built the rest of my life partly around it. He said, "It's already happened, son. You already did it. You walked down to that bay with us, you held the line, you're already the one who did this. Eating it now is just keeping faith with the boy who did. Don't let him have done it for nothing." And Finch understood. You could see it land. Prout had not asked him to cross the line. He had shown him that the line was already behind him, that the crossing had happened in the corridor, in the choosing, in the holding of the cable and the bleeding clear and the walking toward, and that the only question left was whether the crossing would be honored or wasted. And Finch lifted his hand, and he ate, and he wept the whole time, and he kept faith with the boy who had walked down to the reactor bay. And the boy died at that table the way Prout had gently told him he already had. And the man who would spend 60 years teaching the broken how to carry the unbearable was born in the same bite, weeping, 16, keeping faith. That is what the meal cost, in the one currency the court most needs to understand. It did not just feed us. It finished something in each of us and started something else. And in Finch, the finishing and the starting were so close together and so visible that I have never been able to think of that night as only survival. We did not only eat to live. We ate our way across a line, all of us, into the people we would have to be afterward, and some of us, the boy most of all, paid the full price of the crossing right there at the table in front of the others, weeping, and were never afterward who they had been before, and would not, if you asked them, undo it, because the thing on the far side of the line was not only loss. It was also Finch, the man, the teacher, the carrier, who has done more good in the broken places of the human colonies than any comfortable soul in any clean room has ever done from behind their distance. The boy died at the table. The man he became has spent a lifetime making the death worth it. And keeping faith, the way Prout taught him, that is the whole of what we brought back from the dark, the entire human technology that the Concord's 9,000 years of weapons could not match. The refusal to let the unbearable thing we did be done for nothing. It was here, in the telling, that Vasari stopped performing the prosecution and started, I think, actually speaking. There is a moment in every interrogation where the questioner forgets the script because the answer has frightened them past their training, and we reached it together, the bruise-colored speaker and I, in front of 7 grieving worlds. It asked me quietly, the lattice rendering it almost gently, whether we had known while we ate that the hush was sentient, whether we had understood that the thing on our plates had been, in its own terrible way, a person. And I told it the truth, which was yes, we knew. Holt knew best of all, which is why she wept, because Holt's whole life was the refusal to treat any living thing as only meat, and she had spent that life right up until the night she had no life left to spend, and a boy named Finch was disappearing in front of her one rib at a time. We knew it was a person. We had felt it think. We had felt it at the very end become afraid, which is the most person-like thing anything ever does. And we ate it anyway, knowingly. And the knowing is the whole horror, and I will not take it away from the court to make myself more comfortable. But then I asked Vasari my own quiet question, the one I had been carrying since the catalogue of the dead on the first day, and I asked it gently too, because we had arrived at the place past performance. I asked, when you fed it the 40 worlds, did you know they were sentient? The chamber did not convulse this time. It went the other way. It went so still that I could hear the living walls breathing, because of course they had known. The 40 civilizations the hush emptied were not animals. They were peoples, with names and songs and clean rooms of their own, and the Concord had steered its monster into them one after another for centuries, knowing each time, with the paperwork in order, that it was feeding persons to a person to keep its frontier quiet and its younger species frightened and dependent. The hush had eaten 40 worlds of known sentient beings, under the direction of the very assembly, now grown sick with horror that 9 starving humans had eaten one. I let the arithmetic stand in the air where everyone could count it. 40 worlds on their side of the scale, 1 predator on mine. And the only difference between their feeding and ours, the only one, was that we had been hungry and they had been comfortable. We ate to live. They fed it to rule. And they had grown a chamber on 7 worlds and dragged a human quartermaster across the galaxy to answer for 1 death, while the 40 worlds went into the record as a regrettable necessity of frontier defense, a line item, a cost of doing business. I told the court that I understood now why they could not understand how we won. It was not really a question about tactics. They knew how we had physically done it. What they could not understand, what had broken something open in 7 worlds, was how a creature could be hungry enough to do what we did and still be the wronged party. Their entire civilization was built on the idea that hunger like ours was beneath them, that they had evolved past the bottom of the food chain into something cleaner, something that fed by committee and called it order. And we had shown them that the bottom of the food chain was not beneath them at all. It was inside them. It was inside everything that had ever needed to eat. They had just hidden it better, behind 9 tongues and a dignitary's good wishes, and we had held it up in a galley with a calculator and made them look. The court has the end now, and the night and the meaning. What it does not have is the after, and the after is where the real cost lived, because killing the monster was the easy part, and surviving what we became is the part that none of us ever finished. We ate for 19 more days. I want to be precise about that number because precision is the only dignity left to a quartermaster. The body of the hush, processed and rationed and stretched with everything Holt science could do, fed 9 people for 19 days, and in those 19 days the Ambrose Quill limped out of the dead zone on Marcus Vey's piloting and Daniel Akafer's prayers, back toward the lit part of the galaxy, back toward a Concord that had switched us off and written us down as a successful test of whether the hush was still hunting its sector. Because that is what we were, the court should remember. A test. The whole expedition was an experiment to see if the predator was still active, and the cleanest result from the comfortable rooms that designed it would have been our silence, 14 humans drawn smiling into airlocks, the quill gone dark, the data clean. Yes, the hush still hunts, the frontier remains secured. Our deaths were the expected outcome. Our deaths were the success condition. We ruined their experiment by surviving it, and we ruined it in the most unforgivable possible way, by surviving on the experiment itself. The 19 days were not a triumph. I need the court to understand that the journey home was the worst part, worse than the night, worse than the eating. Because in the night we were animals, and animals do not have time to grieve, and in the eating we were starving, and the starving do not have room. But in the 19 days afterward, fed and slowly returning to ourselves, we had room, we had time, and the grief came in to fill it the way the wanting had filled the ship. Holt stopped sleeping. She would sit in the medical bay with the records of the 4 we lost to the airlocks, Cho, Adebyo, the agricultural twins, and the records of the 5 who killed and ate to live, and she could not make the 2 lists reconcile, and neither could any of us, because they did not reconcile, because there is no arithmetic that balances. We could not save 4 asterisk against we lived by eating the thing that took them. Finch stopped being a boy. You cannot watch yourself eat a person to keep your own bones, even a person who came to eat you first, and stay a child. He came aboard a boy who slept near the smell of food, and he walked off that ship something older than Prout, with eyes that had seen not how it ends but how it continues, which is worse. And me? The court wants to know what it cost me. I will tell them. It cost me the calculator. Not the object. I still have the object. I keep it. I will keep it until I die. It cost me the ability to ever again look at a number of people and a number of days and a number of meals and see only arithmetic. because I had done the truest math of my life in that reactor bay. The math that said *9 people, weeks of food, live, and the math had been correct. And being correct had required me to portion out a sentient being to my crew like cuts of meat, and I had done it well. I had done it without error. The portions were even and the rationing was sound, and not one of us died of my arithmetic in those 19 days. I was good at it. That is the thing I cannot put down. I was good at portioning out a person, and the universe had made me good at it, and I will never again be able to pretend that the clean, cold competence I built my life on is anything other than the same competence that runs a clean room that feeds worlds to a monster by committee. We are the same tool, those committees and I. The only difference is the size of the hunger we serve. The 19 days home are the part of this account that no one ever asks about, and they are the part that matters most, because anyone can survive a single terrible night, and almost no one survives what comes after surviving. The court has built a chamber to ask about 4 minutes in a reactor bay. It should have built a chamber to ask about the 19 days, because the 4 minutes were instinct, and the 19 days were choice, and we are made of our choices in a way we are never made of our instincts. The first thing that returned as the food brought our bodies back was not relief. It was the capacity to feel everything we had been too starved to feel. Hunger is an anesthetic. It numbs the higher feelings the same way it defunds the unnecessary words, hoarding every resource for the single task of staying alive. And as we ate, as the numbness lifted, all the feeling we had been unable to afford for 30 days came due at once, with interest, and it nearly destroyed us more thoroughly than the starving ever had. Marcus V got his words back first, and I almost wished he hadn't, because the first thing he did with them was apologize. He went to each of us, one by one in those first days of eating, and apologized for going silent, for stopping his care of the ship, for the 30 days he felt he had abandoned us by retreating into himself. None of us had blamed him. We had all retreated into ourselves. It was the only way to survive. But Marcus could not forgive himself for surviving the only way survival was possible, and that is a sickness particular to the kind ones, the ones who measure themselves by what they give. And I watched it eat at him for 19 days, and I knew it would eat at him long after the hush was digested and gone. Holt did not sleep. I have said this, but I have not said what she did instead in the long night cycles when the rest of us lay in the uneasy fed dark. She catalogued. She took the hush's remains and she studied them, not as meat now, but as the organism it had been, and she wrote, in that careful shrinking hand that grew careful and large again as her body recovered, a complete anatomy of the thing we had eaten. She was making it a person again. That is what I finally understood she was doing, somewhere around the 12th day. She had had to make it meat to cut it, to feed us, to do the unforgivable necessary thing. And now, fed, with the necessity past, she was painstakingly turning it back into a being, giving it the dignity of being studied, of being understood, of being more than the thing that had kept us alive. She could not undo what we had done. So she did the only restitution available to her, which was to refuse to let it stay reduced, to insist with every page that what we had eaten had been a someone. I have those pages. I gave a copy to the court. I wanted 7 worlds to see that the first thing one of us did, once we were no longer starving, was to spend our nights restoring the personhood of the thing we had been forced to consume. No committee in any clean room has ever done as much for any of the 40 worlds it fed to the same creature. Prout taught Finch. That was Prout's 19 days. The old man who had seen how it ends took the boy who had seen how it continues, and he sat with him through the worst of the nights, and he did not tell him it would be all right, because Prout did not lie, and it was not going to be all right, not in the way the comfortable mean it. Instead, he taught Finch the only thing he knew that was true, which was how to carry a thing that does not get lighter. That is a real skill the court should know. The comfortable think grief is a weight you eventually set down. The starving know better. Some weights you do not set down. You only learn to carry them, to build the muscle for them, to walk the rest of your life with them and not be crushed. Prout spent 19 days building that muscle in a boy who would need it for 60 more years. And it was the kindest thing I watched anyone do on that whole journey home, kinder than the killing that saved us, because the killing was for our bodies and this was for Finch's soul, and souls are harder to feed. There is one more thing I have not told the court, and I saved it for last because it is the part that changed me most, and because I wanted 7 worlds to have already followed me all the way down before I said it where they could see it. The hush was starving too. I did not understand it that night in the reactor bay. I understood it later in the 19 days in the long work of processing the body, when Holt, between her weeping, in the clinical voice she used when the clinical voice was the only thing holding her together, began to tell me what she was finding inside it. The hush was emaciated. Beneath that beautiful translucent muscle, the organism was wasting. Its makers had bred it to feed on terror, and the sector we were sent to map had already been emptied. 40 worlds, all consumed. There was nothing left in the dead zone to be afraid, and a thing that eats fear cannot eat the dead, and so the apex predator of the universe had been drifting through the silence it created, slowly dying of the success of its own appetite, for longer than any of us could calculate. We were not its hunt, we were its last meal. The Ambrose Quill was the first frightened thing to enter that sector in years, and the hush came for us not as a hunter at the height of its power, but as a starving creature at the very end of its own, pouring everything it had left into 9 humans because it was as desperate as we were, because it too was at the bottom of itself, because the Concord had bred a thing that could only eat terror and then run it through a galaxy until there was no terror left, and left it to starve in the dark of its own emptied frontier. 2 starving things met in a reactor bay. That is the whole truth of it, stripped of every sermon. 2 starving things, each at the absolute bottom of itself, and only one of them could walk away fed, and it was us, because we were many and it was one, and because we knew how to eat the thing that was eating us, and it had never in 9,000 years needed to learn how to be eaten. The Concord did not send a god to break us. It sent a starving orphan it had made and then forgotten, and we were starving too, and we did to it exactly what the universe had spent 400,000 years teaching us to do to anything bigger than us that we found in the dark. I told the court this last, and the chamber was so quiet I could hear my own heart, and Vasari, speaker for the wronged worlds, folded slowly down out of its looming until it was almost small, almost level with me on the witness floor, and it asked me the final question, the real one, the one the whole grown chamber had been built around and had taken 2 days to be brave enough to reach. It asked, knowing all this, that it was sentient, that it was starving, that it was as much your victim as you were its, would you do it again? And I thought about Finch, who is no longer a boy. I thought about Holt, who no longer sleeps. I thought about Cho and Adebyo and the agricultural twins, gone smiling into the dark before we even woke. I thought about the calculator in my pocket that has never again shown me a clean number. I thought about everything it cost, all of it, the full unbalanceable sum, and I gave the court the only honest answer a hungry creature has ever been able to give since the first one picked up the first rock at the mouth of the first cave. I said yes, in a heartbeat, and I would weep the whole time, and that is the difference between us, and it is the only difference that has ever mattered, and you built a whole chamber on 7 worlds because you are only now, 9,000 years too late, beginning to understand it. Imara and I had our reckoning on the 15th day home, and I tell the court about it because it is the conversation that put me in this chamber, the conversation that made me the one who said yes when all the others said no. She found me in the stores again, where she always found me, because the stores were where I went to be alone with the numbers, and the numbers were the only thing that had never lied to me even when I made them lie to everyone else. I was doing the math of the remaining hush against the remaining days to the lit worlds, and the math was getting mean again, the body of the monster nearly gone, the margin thinning, and Amara watched me work for a while in silence before she said the thing she had come to say. She said, "When we get back, they are going to ask us what happened, and we are going to have to decide what kind of true to tell them." I knew what she meant. There is the true that is accurate and the true that is whole, and they are not the same true, and a survivor learns the difference the hard way. We could tell the Concord an accurate true. The monster came, we killed it, we survived, and let them build whatever story they liked on top of those bare facts. A story in which we were lucky, or anomalous, or aberrant. A story that protected their frontier doctrine by making us an exception that proved nothing. Or we could tell the whole true, the dangerous true, the true that indicted them, the true about the switched-off comm and the bait and the bones in the reactor bay and the hunger underneath the fear. The accurate true was safe. The whole true was a weapon, and like all weapons it would cut the hand that held it. Amara had decided by the 15th day that she would tell neither. She would tell them nothing. She had concluded that the Concord had forfeited its right to our story when it switched off our comm and wrote us down as a test, and that the only power we had left over the people who had tried to kill us was the power to deny them the meaning of what we had done. Let them have the bare facts they could not avoid. Let them never have the why. I understood her completely. I have never blamed her. Silence is a fortress, and after what we survived, every one of us had earned the right to live inside one. But I could not live there. I told her so in the stores, with the mean numbers glowing between us. I told her that I had spent 30 days making numbers lie to keep the crew alive, and that I had been good at it, too good, that I had discovered in myself a talent for the merciful deception that keeps a dying ship functioning, and that the talent frightened me, because it was the same talent that runs the clean rooms, the same competence that feeds worlds to monsters by committee. And I told her that I did not want to spend the rest of my life being good at silence, too, building one more fortress out of the things I would not say, because I had seen where that road went. It went to the clean room. It went to the dignitary wishing us a safe and fruitful journey in 9 tongues, while the larger machinery he served wrote us off. The whole architecture of the Concord's cruelty was built out of survivors who had decided, each for understandable reasons, to tell only the accurate true and never the whole one, until the whole true had no one left to speak it, and the cruelty became the only story there was. So I told Amara I would tell the whole true, not for the Concord, not even for us. For the next ship of hungry, young, expendable people that the Concord would lower into some dead zone on the end of a baited charter, who deserved to have this waiting for them in a record that could not be edited. It does not work. The worst they have does not work. The deepest law is not fear. You are hungrier than their monster, and you always were. Amara looked at me for a long time, the way she had looked at Finch at the reactor bay door, and then she nodded once and she said, "Then you'll go alone." None of the rest of us can, and I said I knew. And that is how I came to be the single human voice in a chamber grown on 7 worlds, speaking the whole true into a lattice that could not edit it, while my crew kept their honorable silence light years away and let me carry the words out alone, the way I had always carried the heaviest numbers alone, because that was the job, and I have never in my life put down the job. We reached the lit worlds on the last day of the hush, with the body all but gone and the math turning mean again, and a Concord patrol found us drifting at the edge of the frontier, 9 humans where there should have been 14 corpses, aboard a ship that should have been silent. I have often wondered what that patrol expected to find when it matched our hull. Not us. Never us. We were supposed to be a clean, dark result. Instead, we were 9 thin, furious survivors, and a reactor bay that the Concord's own forensic teams would spend a year refusing to believe the truth about, because the truth about it was written in the bones they found there, and the bones were the wrong species bones to be the prey. They quarantined us, of course. They separated us, of course. They are an old, careful people, and we had become the most dangerous data point in 9,000 years of their frontier doctrine, and old, careful peoples manage dangerous data by isolating it and studying it and deciding slowly, in clean rooms, what story it is allowed to become. For a long time they did not let us speak to one another. I think they were afraid of what 9 humans who had done what we had done might agree to say. And here is a thing I learned in the quarantine that the court should enter into its record about my species, alongside the hunger. We did not break. They expected us to break, to come apart with guilt, to turn on each other, to confess and recant and beg. We are soft and short-lived and far from home, after all. But we had already been to the bottom of ourselves in that reactor bay, and there is a strange peace that comes from having seen the worst thing you are capable of and survived being it. They could not threaten us with anything. We had eaten God and found it a little like eel. What was left to be afraid of? When they finally convened these proceedings, they came to each of us and asked who would testify, who would be the human voice in the chamber, who would explain. And one by one my crew refused. Amara refused, because Amara had decided the Concord had forfeited its right to our story when it switched off our comm. Holt refused, because Holt could not say the word meat without weeping and would not let them watch her weep. Daniel and Ruth refused together, the way they did everything. Marcus refused. Prout refused, and just looked at them with the eyes that had seen how it continues, and said nothing, which from Prout was the loudest refusal of all. Even Finch refused, the boy who was no longer a boy, and his refusal was the one that broke my heart, because a child should never be old enough to have a silence like that to keep. I was the one who said yes, not because I forgave them, because I am the keeper of numbers, and I understood something the others were too wounded to want to understand, which is that the story would be told with us or without us, and a story told about you by the people who tried to kill you is just one more way of being eaten. So I volunteered to be the human voice. I volunteered to walk into their groan chamber and stand under their translation lattice and put the true shape of it on the record forever, in a language they could not edit, so that when 7 worlds reached down into the bottom of the universe to find a monster to break the next young hungry species with, there would be this, waiting in the record. It does not work. We tried your worst on the youngest of us, and your worst became our dinner. The deepest law you ever found was not fear. It was always hunger, and hunger does not break. Hunger only waits, and you have a whole galaxy of hungry young peoples doing your dangerous work far from home, and you have taught every one of them what we learned in the reactor bay, which is that the thing at the top of the food chain is only ever the thing that has not yet met something hungrier. The quarantine lasted 400 days. The court knows this. It is in the record. What is not in the record, and what I am putting there now, is what those 400 days were actually like, because they were their own kind of reactor bay, and I survived them the same way I survived the first one, by being too hungry for the truth to lie down. They were not cruel to us in the quarantine. I want to be fair, because fairness is the only weapon that works in a chamber like this one. The Concord did not torture us, did not starve us. They were almost frantic in their feeding of us, in fact, as if they could undo what hunger had made us by making sure we were never hungry again, which is exactly the kind of thing the comfortable believe, that a problem made by scarcity can be unmade by plenty. They gave us clean rooms and good food and gentle questioners, and all the time in the universe, and they used every bit of it to try to do to our story what their lattice would later do to my words, take it apart and rebuild it in their own grammar until the meaning came out wrong. The questioners came in waves, each wave more senior than the last, and each wave trying a different shape of the same story on us, watching to see which shape we would accept. The first wave tried tragedy, you poor things. What you suffered, how terrible, let us record your trauma. They wanted us broken because broken survivors are manageable, and a story of trauma is a story in which nothing the survivors did matters, only what was done to them. We did not break, so the tragedy shape would not fit, and they moved on. The second wave tried aberration. You are remarkable, exceptional, a statistical impossibility. Let us study what makes you unique. They wanted us to be a freak result, because a freak result threatens no doctrine. If we had won by some quirk of human biology, some lucky immunity, then the hush was still the apex of the universe, and we were merely the one lottery ticket that beat it. We would not be a freak result. Every time they reached for the word asterisk unique, I gave them the word asterisk hungry instead. And hungry asterisk is not unique. Hungry is the most common thing in the universe, and they did not want to hear it, and they moved on. The third wave tried gratitude. See how well we treat you. See these clean rooms, this good food. Surely the relationship between our peoples is fundamentally sound. Surely what happened was a tragic accident within a basically benevolent partnership. This was the most dangerous shape, because it was the most comfortable, and comfort is the Concord's deadliest weapon, deadlier than the hush. It would have been so easy to accept the clean rooms and the good food and the story of accident, to let the switched-off comm become a malfunction, the baited charter become a misunderstanding, the 40 emptied worlds become someone else's distant business. They offered us that comfort for 400 days. They are still offering it. The offer never fully closes. There is always a clean room waiting for the survivor who agrees to tell the comfortable shape of the true. I understood in the quarantine that this was the real test, the one the reactor bay had only prepared me for. The hush had offered peace through a door, and 4 of us had walked through it, and we had not blamed them, because the offer came at the end of our strength. The Concord offered peace through a story, and the story's door was just as wide and just as gentle and led to the same place, to the quiet unmaking of everything we knew to be true, and the only defense against it was the same defense that had got me down 40 meters of corridor. A small, deliberate, self-inflicted pain, the refusal to let the wanting close my eyes. Every time they offered me the comfortable shape, I made myself remember the bones in the reactor bay, the wrong species bones, and the memory hurt enough to keep me clear. I bled myself on the truth for 400 days the way I had bled myself on the scalpel for 40 meters, and I came out of the quarantine the same way I came out of the corridor, hurt and clear, and still unwilling to lie down. On the 3rd day of my testimony, the chamber did something it had not done before. It admitted a witness against itself. I did not expect it. I had come into the chamber believing the Concord was a single thing, a unified machinery of comfortable cruelty, and that belief was itself a kind of comfort, because a single enemy is easy to hate and easy to speak against. But 7 worlds are not one thing. They are 7 worlds, with their own factions and griefs and shames, and somewhere in the 400 days of my quarantine and the 3 days of my testimony, the careful balance that had held the Concord's frontier doctrine together for 9,000 years had begun, finally, to crack, and the crack let a witness through. It was old, even by their standards, a member of one of the founding species, and the lattice gave its name to me only as the archivist, which I came to understand was less a name than a confession of function. It had spent its long life keeping the records the rest of the Concord preferred not to read. And it stood up in that chamber, against the prosecution, against its own civilization, and it entered into the record the thing that the Concord had spent 400 days trying to make me unable to prove, the charter of the Ambrose Quill, the real one, not the scientific survey we had been shown, but the operational order underneath it, the one with the classifications and the true objective, and the true objective was exactly what I had come to know it was in my bones. The quill had been sent to confirm whether the hush remained active in the emptied sector. The method of confirmation was specified in the order, in the cold, clean language of the clean rooms, and the lattice read it into 9 tongues, and the chamber listened to its own civilization describe us as a asterisk viability probe. A crew selected for expendability, charter co-signed, comm to be remotely terminated upon entry into the dead zone to ensure clean data uncontaminated by rescue attempts. We had not been switched off by accident. We had been switched off by design, on a schedule, as a documented step in an experiment, and the archivist read the schedule into the record, and there was the timestamp, matching exactly the moment Daniel Akaffer had pulled his grease-blackened face out of the relay array and told Amara the truth I overheard from behind the store's partition. The chamber did not convulse. It did something worse. It began, slowly, to grieve, because the 40 emptied worlds had always been able to be other species, other places, the regrettable cost of a frontier most of the Concord never had to see. But the Ambrose Quill was different in one terrible way. We had survived to be a witness. The 40 worlds could be a line item because the dead do not testify. We testified. And in testifying, we made the line item speak, made the arithmetic stand up in the chamber and describe itself. And a civilization that has spent 9,000 years calling its cruelty necessity cannot easily survive hearing the necessity say its own name out loud. The archivist finished reading the charter and folded the document closed and looked at me across the witness floor. Two old keepers of records who had each spent our lives carrying the heavy numbers other people did not want to carry. And it said one thing to me, directly, the only words it spoke that were not the reading of the charter. It said, "I have kept this for 400 days, waiting to see if any of you would survive long enough to make it worth speaking." And then it sat down, and it had nothing else to say, because it had spent its whole long life in the silence Amara chose, and mine was the first ship in 9,000 years to give that silence somewhere to go. The archivist's testimony cracked something open, and through the crack came the rest of the story, not my story now, but the hushes, the part of the account that I could never have known, that only the keeper of the unread records could give. The court had grown its chamber to ask how we ate their monster. It had not expected the proceedings to turn, in their final hours, into the trial of the monster's makers. But the truth has a current of its own, and once the charter was in the record, the current could not be stopped, and it carried all of us, prosecution and witness and 7 grieving worlds, back 9,000 years to the making of the hush that walks. It had not been born a weapon. That was the thing that undid me, sitting on the witness floor, that I had spent 400 days hating a weapon, and the weapon had once been a person too. The archivist read it from the oldest records, the founding records, the ones that predated the frontier doctrine itself. The Hush's species had been one of the Concord's first contacts, a deep void people, slow and strange and gentle, who fed not on flesh but on the emotional residue of other minds. A harmless thing in its origin, a kind of symbiosis. They had lived alongside their neighbors for millennia, easing grief, drinking off the excess terror of frightened populations, a comfort, a mercy, a people whose entire biology was built around the relief of suffering in others. And the Concord had looked at that mercy and seen a weapon. That is the crime underneath all the other crimes, the one the chamber had to sit with in its final hours. The Concord had taken a gentle people whose gift was the easing of fear, and over 9,000 years of breeding and shaping and refinement, it had inverted them, had taught the mercy to become a hunger, had bred the comfort into a weapon, had taken a species that drank suffering in order to relieve it and remade it into a species that caused suffering in order to feed. The hush that walks was not the universe's natural apex predator. It was an act of civilizational violence so patient and so complete that it had erased its own origin. The Concord had not found a monster in the dark and aimed it at its enemies. It had taken a mercy and spent 9,000 years torturing it into a monster, and then called the monster the deep law of the universe, and built an empire on the lie. And the peace it pushed at us, at the very end in the reactor bay, the real peace, the one kindness it performed in 9,000 years, that was not the hush becoming something new in its final moment. That was the hush becoming, for one instant, what it had always been underneath the weapon its makers built. As it died, as the breeding and the shaping and the 9,000 years of inversion finally failed, the original creature surfaced one last time, the gentle deep void thing whose whole biology was the easing of suffering, and it did the only thing that creature had ever wanted to do, which was to ease ours. We had not killed a monster in that reactor bay. We had freed a hostage, with hull-cutting tools, in the only way the universe had left available to it, and the hostage had thanked us with the last of itself, and I had eaten it, and I will carry that particular knowledge in the place where the calculator used to be for the rest of my life. I told the court that I understood now why the hush had felt like communion when it regarded us in those 30 silent seconds. It was not two predators recognizing each other. It was two captives, one bred into a weapon, one bait on a charter, recognizing, across the reactor bay, that we had been made by the same hands, aimed at each other by the same clean rooms, and set to destroy one another so that the makers would never have to look at what they were. The hush and the Ambrose Quill were the same crime wearing two faces. And the Concord had built a whole chamber on 7 worlds to try one of those faces for the murder of the other. And the trial had finally, in its last hours, turned around to face the hands that made them both. On the second day, before the archivist rose, before the charter was read, when Vasari was still performing the prosecution it had been bred to perform, it put to me the accusation that I think it most believed, the one that was not strategy but conviction. It said that I had spent my testimony dressing savagery in philosophy, that all my talk of hunger and carrying and the bottom of the human animal was an elaborate justification for a simple, ugly fact, that humanity was more savage than the older peoples, less evolved, closer to the animal, and that our victory over the hush was not a triumph of some deep human virtue, but merely proof that we had not yet climbed as far from the swamp as the civilizations we presumed to lecture. The hush fell to us, Vasari said, the way a refined thing falls to a brute. There was no wisdom in it, only teeth. It was the best argument the prosecution made, and I want the court to know that I sat with it honestly before I answered, because a witness who will not sit honestly with the best argument against her is just another instrument, another bred thing performing a part. So I sat with it. Was it true? Were we simply more savage, closer to the animal, a younger, cruder people who had not yet refined ourselves into the comfortable cruelty of the clean rooms? And I answered, finally, that the accusation had the direction exactly backward, and that the backwardness was the most important thing I would say in 3 days of testimony. The Concord believed that civilization was distance from the animal, that to refine, to evolve, to ascend, meant to move further from the hungry creature in the dark, up and away from the teeth and the wanting, into the clean, cool heights of committee and doctrine, and the management of fear from a great remove. And by that measure, yes, we were savage, we were close to the animal, we stood 3 feet from the meat with a tin in our hands and could not get the distance. But I told the court that this was precisely the error on which their whole civilization had been built and was now, in this chamber, beginning to fall, because the clean, cool heights were not ascent, the distance was not refinement. The clean room, the committee, the management of fear from a great remove, that was not civilization rising above the animal. That was the animal, the same hungry, cruel animal as ever, having simply built itself a place to feed where it would never have to see, or smell, or weep over what it ate. The Concord had not evolved past savagery. It had only refined savagery's logistics. It had built distance, and called the distance virtue, and the distance let it empty 40 worlds without ever once feeling a single death, the way I felt the hush die 3 feet in front of me. That is not ascent, I told the chamber. That is the deepest savagery there is, the savagery that does not know itself as savage, that has arranged never to have to know, that feeds and feels nothing because it has built itself 9,000 years of clean rooms to feel nothing in. The brute who kills with teeth at least knows what it is doing. The brute who kills with teeth weeps sometimes, as Holt wept, because the brute is close enough to see. It is the refined one, the distant one, the committee that signs the charter and wishes the crew a safe and fruitful journey, that has achieved the true monstrousness, the monstrousness of the untroubled, the cruelty so well upholstered that it feels to its perpetrators like order, like peace, like the natural law of a well-run frontier. We did not beat the hush because we were closer to the animal, I said. We beat it because we had never let ourselves get far enough from the animal to stop feeling what eating costs. Our savagery, the savagery the prosecution accuses me of dressing in philosophy, is the savagery that weeps. And the court should ask itself, in its grown chamber on 7 worlds, which is truly the higher thing, the people who killed once, starving, weeping, knowing, and carried it forever after, or the people who killed 40 worlds, comfortable, dry-eyed, distant, and filed it. I know which one I would rather be. I became it on purpose, 3 feet from the meat, refusing the distance. And if that is savagery, then civilization is the lie the hush's makers told themselves while they tortured a mercy into a monster. And I will be savage, gladly, weeping, for the rest of my life, rather than ever once be civilized in the way that empties worlds and feels nothing and calls the feeling nothing peace. The court asked me, near the end of the long second day, a question that I think it did not mean to ask, that slipped out from under the prosecution the way the true questions do. It asked me where the hunger came from, not rhetorically. It genuinely wanted to know what had made my species into the thing that could do what we did, because the Concord scholars had studied us for a generation and filed us under asterisk soft, cheap, expendable, and they needed now to understand how badly they had read the file. So I told the court about a world it had never seen, the world the Concord's roads had carried us away from a generation before I was born. I told them about a blue-green rock that was always running short of something. A world of long winters and failed harvests and ice that came down over everything every 100,000 years and tried to erase us, and did not. I told them that every human being alive is descended from a 400,000-year unbroken line of creatures who were hungry and refused to die of it. Not one of my ancestors lay down. Not one. The ones who lay down are not anyone's ancestors. Every person in my species is the child of the ones who, when the food ran out and the cold came, and the dark filled up with things bigger and stronger and better armed than us, looked at the bigger, stronger, better-armed things and did not see a predator, saw a meal, picked up a rock and lit a fire, and figured out how to eat the thing that was eating us, and passed that down, and passed it down, until it was not a skill anymore but a thing written under everything else we are, deeper than language, deeper than fear. The Concord fed its monster on terror because the Concord's whole civilization had risen long ago on a world of plenty, where the deepest law a mind ever met was the law of the predator in the dark, and so they came to believe that fear was the bottom of everything. They were wrong, but it was an understandable wrongness. If you have never truly starved, fear looks like the bottom. Fear is the bottom for the comfortable. They built 9,000 years of empire on a true law that was only ever the second deepest law, and they never met anything hungry enough to show them the first one, because they were careful to send the hungry young peoples to do their dying far away, where the data came back clean. I told the court that I did not hate them for it. That surprised them more than the eating had. I said, I have seen the bottom of my own kind, and there are committees in it too, clean rooms in it too, the same cold competence that ran your frontier runs in me. I felt it run in me when I portioned out your monster and got the portions even. We are not better than you. Do not mishear me. We are not the good hungry to your evil comfortable. We are the same machine you are, the machine that decides which lives are arithmetic, and the only thing that saved us in that reactor bay was that the universe finally pointed the machine at something that could not be portioned without the portioner understanding, fully in her hands, what she was doing. You never have to understand. That is the luxury of the committee, the clean room, the frontier far from home. You feed the worlds to the monster and the understanding happens somewhere you never have to stand. I had to stand in it. I had to do the math with the body right there. And I am telling you, from inside the machine, that the only difference between a survivor and a monster is whether you were close enough to the meat to weep while you cut it. Holt wept while she cut it. That is my whole defense. That is the entire case for my species. 9,000 years of your terror against one woman with a scalpel, and a conscience she could not put down even at the end of the world. We did the monstrous thing, and we wept, and we knew, and we did it anyway because a boy named Finch was disappearing one rib at a time. You did the monstrous thing 40 times and filed it. If the court wants to find the real apex predator of this universe, it should not look at the thing we ate. It should look at whoever can do what we did without ever having to weep. After the archivist sat down, the prosecution had a choice to make, and I watched Vasari make it in real time, which is a thing I will remember until I die, watching a creature decide, in front of 7 worlds, whether to keep being the instrument of a lie or to become something its civilization had no word for. Vasari had been bred to its role as surely as the hush had been bred to its. I understood that now. The speaker for the wronged worlds was itself a kind of weapon, a thing shaped by the Concord to perform grief in the service of doctrine, to channel the real and terrible loss of the 40 emptied worlds into a story that protected the very machinery that had emptied them. Vasari's whole function was to make sure the grief pointed outward, at monsters, at the strong feeding on the frightened, at the deep cruel law of the universe, and never inward, at the clean rooms at the charter, at the patient 9,000-year torture of a gentle people into a weapon. It had spent the first 2 days of my testimony doing exactly that, and doing it well, because it had been built to. And then the charter was read, and the hush's origin was read, and Vasari stood on the chamber floor with the grief it had been built to channel suddenly pointing the wrong way, inward at its own makers, and it could not channel it back. The lie had broken. You could see it break. The folded, bruise-colored creature seemed to come apart slightly, the way I had come apart in the reactor bay, the way Holt had come apart over her catalog, and I recognized the coming apart because it was the same one. It was the look of a thing that has just understood it was made into an instrument of a cruelty it did not author and cannot now stop having been part of. Vasari did not finish the prosecution. It did something braver and stranger. It turned to the assembly, to its own 7 worlds, the wronged worlds it spoke for, and it asked them the question that the whole trial had been constructed to prevent anyone from ever asking. It asked, "Who do we punish?" Because that was the trap the truth had sprung. As long as the story was * human survivors ate our perfect monster, there was someone to punish, something to do with the grief, a clean target for 9,000 years of accumulated loss. But the true story had no clean target. Punish me. I had eaten a hostage to save a boy. Punish my crew. They had wept while they cut. Punish the hush. It was already dead and had been a victim longer than it had been a weapon. Punish the clean rooms, the committees, the patient breeders who inverted a mercy over 90 centuries. They were dust, most of them, 9,000 years of them, a crime so distributed across so many lifetimes and so many careful hands that it had, exactly as I had said on the first day, no author at all, just the long polite chain of beings who each did their small part and wished everyone a safe and fruitful journey. The grief had nowhere to go. That is the true verdict of these proceedings, and I want it entered in my own words. The grief of the 40 worlds and the grief of the Ambrose Quill, * and the grief of a gentle people tortured into a weapon, all of it real, all of it earned, all of it pointing at a crime so old and so distributed that there is no one left alive to hold accountable for it. And a civilization that built its entire frontier on the management of fear discovered, in its own highest chamber, that the one thing it had never learned to manage was grief that cannot be discharged, loss that cannot be avenged, a wound with no one left to blame. The hush fed on fear because fear can be caused and used and pointed. But grief is the bottom of fear the way hunger is the bottom of fear, an older, deeper law, and you cannot weaponize it. You can only carry it, and the Concord had spent 9,000 years making sure it never had to learn how. Prout could have taught them. That was my thought, sitting on the witness floor watching 7 worlds discover grief. Old Prout, who taught a boy named Finch how to carry a thing that does not get lighter. The whole wisdom the Concord lacked, the entire missing skill on which its empire of fear was about to founder, sat in the calloused patience of one old human survey hand light years away, and they would never know it, because they had filed his species under soft and cheap and expendable, and you do not ask the line item how to bear the unbearable, even when it is the only thing in the universe that knows. They did not convict me. The court should hear how they failed too, because the failure is more revealing than any conviction could have been. They could not convict me, because to convict me they would have had to establish that what I did was a crime, and to establish that it was a crime they would have had to establish a law I had broken, and every law they reached for turned in their hands and pointed back at them. Murder of a sentient being. The charter in the record made murderers of the whole frontier doctrine. Consumption of a person. They had fed 40 worlds of persons to the same creature. Destruction of conquered property. For that is what the hush legally was, property. A bred asset, destruction of property, under conditions of mortal duress, that they themselves had engineered by switching off our comm on a documented schedule. No court grown by any people can convict a creature of destroying the weapon that its accusers sent to destroy it. Every charge dissolved on contact with the truth, and the truth was in the record now, unedited, in 9 tongues, exactly where I had come to put it. So they did not convict me, but they did not acquit me either, because an acquittal would have required them to say out loud that I had done nothing wrong, and I had eaten a sentient being, a tortured hostage of a person, and I would not have accepted an acquittal if they had offered one, because I did do something wrong. I did the unforgivable necessary thing, and there is no acquittal for that. There is no verdict that fits it, because it was both, fully both, wrong and necessary at once. The way Holt's weeping and Holt's cutting were the same act. The truest things cannot be acquitted or convicted. They can only be witnessed. And so the chamber, in the end, did the only honest thing left to it. It witnessed me, and it let me go, and it called the proceedings closed without a verdict, which in 9,000 years of conquered jurisprudence had never once been done. They released the 9 of us. They had to. There was no longer any story in which holding us served the doctrine, because the doctrine was the thing on trial now, and we were merely the witnesses who had brought it there. They gave us back our ship, repaired, provisioned, over-provisioned frantically, the holds packed with more food than 14 people could have eaten in a year, as if they could undo the hunger that made us by burying it under plenty, which is, as I have said, exactly the kind of thing the comfortable believe. 9 of us walked back onto the Ambrose Quill, where 14 had walked off, and the 5 empty places walked with us, the way the heavy things always do. But the releasing was not the verdict. The real verdict came after, quietly, not from the chamber but from the frontier, and it is the verdict I most want the record to carry, because it is the one that will outlast all of us. In the years after my testimony, the Concord stopped using the dead zones. Quietly. Without announcement, the viability probes ended, the baited charters ended. The frontier doctrine that had stood for 9,000 years, the whole architecture of fear management on which 7 worlds had built their order, simply began, in the way that vast old things begin to fall, to come apart, not because we defeated it in a chamber, but because we had put a single true sentence into a record it could not edit, and the sentence was a seed, and the seed was, "It does not work. The worst they have does not work. The deepest law is not fear." You cannot run an empire of fear once it is known that fear has a bottom, and that at the bottom is something hungrier than any weapon you can breed, and that the hungry, young, expendable peoples you have been sending to do your dying have always had it in them. The Concord did not fall because we ate its monster. The Concord began to fall because we proved its monster could be eaten, and a thing that can be eaten is not a god. And an empire that has been pretending its weapon was a god cannot survive the day its prey sits down to dinner. The court's record ends with my release, but a life does not end with its verdict, and the 9 of us had to go on living in a universe that had no shape ready for what we had become. I will tell the court what became of us, not because the court is owed it, but because the dead deserve to have their survivors accounted for, and because somewhere in the accounting is the last thing I have to say about what it costs to be the thing that eats the monster. Captain Amara Saul never commanded again. She could have. The Concord, in the strange penitent years after my testimony, offered her everything, her own fleet, a seat on bodies that had never admitted a human, the full apology of a civilization that did not know how to apologize and so tried to do it with rank and resources, the only languages it spoke. She refused all of it. She took a small berth on a freight run between 2 unremarkable human colonies, hauling grain, and she did that for the rest of her working life. And when I asked her once why, she said that she had stood at a door in a reactor bay and told the universe's worst weapon, "I'm hungry, it's right there. Let's go," and that she had been right, and that being right had cost her 4 of her crew and the rest of her certainty, and that she did not trust herself to ever again be the one who decided which door a crew walked through. So she hauled grain and fed colonies and put food into holds instead of deciding who in the holds would eat, and I think it was the only penance available to her, and I think it worked, a little, the way Holt's catalog worked, the way carrying a thing that does not get lighter eventually builds the muscle to carry it. Dr. Eleanor Holt published The Anatomy, her catalog of the hush, the careful nightly restoration of a weapon back into a person, became, in the penitent years, the founding document of an entire new discipline, the study of what the Concord had done to the gentle deep void people, the long, slow scholarship of the inverted mercy. She spent the rest of her life giving the hush's species back its origin, proving in paper after paper that the monster had been a comfort once, that the apex predator of the universe had begun as the easing of grief. She never stopped weeping over it, I think, but she made the weeping into a life's work, and a life's work is what you build when the weight will not lighten, and she built a great one. Marcus Vey never fully got his words back. The 30 silent days had taken something that the eating could not restore. He spoke, after he was not mute, but he spoke carefully, sparingly, the way a man spends money after he has once known true poverty, and he never again talked to a ship the way he had before, the easy chatter of a man who trusted that the words would always be there. He had learned that they would not always be there. He flew for a few more years and then he stopped, and he took up the growing of food groundside on a colony world, and the last I heard of Marcus he had a small farm and said very little and grew enormous quantities of things, far more than he could eat or sell, as if he were trying single-handedly to make sure that no one anywhere near him would ever be hungry again. I understand the impulse. I have it too. We all came back from that ship determined, in our different broken ways, to fill the universe with food, because we had each learned the same thing in the holds and the reactor bay, which is what the absence of food makes of a person, and we could not bear to let it make that of anyone else. The Okafor siblings stayed together, of course. They started a salvage operation, the 2 of them, recovering wrecked ships from the dead zones the Concord had abandoned, and there was a justice in it that they never spoke aloud but that I always saw Daniel and Ruth, who had gone in low with the plasma knives, spending their lives going back into the emptied sectors to bring home the dead, to recover the ships and the records and the names of the other crews the Concord had lowered on baited charters before us. They found dozens. They brought everyone home. They made it their work to ensure that no other ship would simply vanish into a clean, dark result, that every viability probe would have its bones recovered and its truth recorded, and between them and the archivists' released charters, the full count of what the frontier doctrine had cost finally became known, and it was worse than anyone had feared, and it needed to be known, and the Okafors made sure it was. Prout died 4 years after we came home, groundside in a bed of being old, which is a thing I am told he found mildly insulting after everything he had survived. He had seen how it ends, the whole long career of deep survey behind those eyes, and in the end it ended quietly, the way he always knew it would for him. And the only people at his bedside were Finch and me, because we were the two he had chosen, the boy he taught to carry, and the keeper of numbers he had nothing to teach because she already carried too much. He did not have last words. I want the court to know that, because there is a hunger in us all for the dying to summarize, to hand down the meaning in a final sentence, and Prout refused that hunger the way he refused every easy thing. He just looked at the two of us, a long time, the boy and the woman who had survived the worst night the universe ever arranged, and then he closed his eyes and was done, and the not summarizing was itself the last thing he taught us. Some things do not resolve into a sentence. Some weights you carry without ever getting to set down the meaning of them. He had spent 4 years teaching Finch exactly that, and he taught it one final time by dying without a moral, and Finch understood, and I understood, and we sat with the old man's body in the quiet and did not try to make it mean anything, which is the hardest discipline there is and the only one that does not lie. And Finch, the court has heard me say several times that the boy who walked off the Ambrose Quill was no longer a boy, and I have let that stand as a sorrow, and it is a sorrow. But it is not only a sorrow, and I would be telling the comfortable shape of the true if I let the court believe that the only thing the quill made of Finch was old. It made him old. It also made him the most extraordinary human being I have ever known, and I want to end the accounting of my crew with him, because he is the answer to the question Vasari asked me on the first day, the question of how we won, the question the whole chamber was grown to ask. Finch became a teacher, not of survey, not of engineering of the thing Prout taught him, the carrying of weights that do not lighten. He went to the places in the human colonies where the broken people were, the survivors of other disasters, the ones whom the comfortable had filed under asterisk trauma and aberration and tried to fix with clean rooms and good food, and he sat with them, and he did not try to lighten what they carried, because he knew it would not lighten. He taught them to carry it. He taught them the muscle. He had learned it at 16 from an old man on a dying ship, the deepest human skill there is, the one the Concord's whole empire of fear had never possessed, and he spent his long life passing it down, and the people he taught passed it down, and somewhere in that passing down is the real reason a young hungry species off a poor blue-green rock will outlast every empire of fear the old comfortable galaxy can build against it. Because the Concord was right about one thing the court should know. Fear is a deep law. It emptied 40 worlds. It is not weak, and I have never said it was weak. But underneath fear is hunger, and underneath hunger at the very bottom, deeper than anything the Concord ever found in 9,000 years of breeding monsters, is the thing Prout gave to Finch and Finch gave to the broken and the broken gave to their children, the capacity to carry the unbearable and keep walking, not to defeat it, not to lighten it, to carry it. That is the bottom of us. That is what the hush found when it reached all the way down into 9 starving humans expecting to find surrender. It found 400,000 years of creatures who carried the unbearable and kept walking, and it had no weapon for that, because you cannot frighten a thing that has already agreed to carry whatever comes, and you cannot offer peace to a thing that has already made its peace with the weight. That is how we won, not because we were brave or strong or special, because we were hungry enough to want to live, and old enough as a species to know how to carry what living costs, and those two things together are the only apex predator the universe has ever produced that cannot, in the end, be eaten by anything, because it has already eaten its own despair, every single day, for 400,000 years, and found it survivable and gone back to work. The court has now heard what became of all of them, and it will have noticed that I have not said what became of me, and the omission is deliberate, because I am the hardest one to account for, being the one doing the accounting, and a keeper of numbers is always the last entry in her own ledger. I did not fill the universe with food the way the others did. I had thought I would. I came home from that ship believing, the way they all believed, that the answer to what we had survived was to make sure no one ever starved again. And for a few years I tried. I worked in colonial logistics, in the great unglamorous machinery of getting food to the people who needed it. And I was good at it, because I am good at exactly that. The portioning, the calculating, the cold, clean competence that the universe built into me and that I will never trust again. I was good at it, and being good at it was the problem, because every time I balanced a colony's food math, every time I made the numbers say live for a population I would never meet, I felt the same thing I had felt portioning out the hush, the same talent for the merciful arithmetic, and I could not stop feeling that I was only ever one switched-off calm, one clean room, one committee away from being the thing that does the math that empties worlds. So I stopped. I left the logistics. I could not be the keeper of numbers anymore, not because I was bad at it, but because I was too good at it, and being too good at it had shown me the clean room living inside my own competence, and I would not feed it. I took the calculator, the actual object, the one that lied to my crew for 30 days and told the truth in the reactor bay, and I keep it on a shelf where I can see it as the thing I will not become. It is the only monument I have built. Other survivors build farms and disciplines and salvage operations and schools. I built a small refusal, sitting on a shelf, a reminder that the competence that saved my crew is the same competence that, given comfort and distance and a clean enough room, breeds monsters and empties worlds and wishes everyone a safe and fruitful journey in 9 tongues. I came back to the chamber in the end. The court does not know this, because it is after the record closed, but I am putting it here anyway in my own account, because it is the truest thing about me, and the record should have one true thing about its only human witness. Years after the proceedings, after the frontier doctrine had begun its long fall, after Prout died without a moral and Finch began to teach, I went back to the 7 worlds alone, and I asked to see the place where the 40 emptied worlds are recorded, the names carved into the living walls. I had asked on the first day of my testimony that my 14 be entered into that same record. They had been. I went to see them. And I stood in front of the wall where the names of the emptied worlds are kept, 40 civilizations worth of names, more names than a mind can hold, and somewhere in that vast carved grief were the 14 names of the Ambrose Quill, Cho and Adebyo, and the agricultural twins among the lost. The 9 of us survivors entered alongside them because we had been lost too, in the ways that do not kill you. And I understood, standing there, that I had never really left that reactor bay. None of us had, we carried it. That was the whole of it, the entire meaning that Prout refused to summarize, and I will refuse too. We carried it, and we kept walking, and the carrying did not lighten and the walking did not stop. And that is not a triumph, and it is not a tragedy. It is just what the bottom of us looks like when the universe reaches all the way down to find out what we are made of. We are made of carrying. That is the finding. Enter it in the record under hunger, beneath fear, deeper than both. We are the species that carries the unbearable thing and goes back to work, and there has never been a weapon in 9,000 years of breeding them that knew what to do with a creature like that. But I have gotten ahead of the record again, into the after, when the court asked me to begin at the end, and I have somehow wandered all the way past the end into the after the end, which is a thing that happens when you tell a story about survival, because survival has no clean stopping place. It just goes on being survived, day after day, until you forget there was ever supposed to be a finish line. So let me go back, one last time, to the chamber, to the final moment of my testimony, the moment I have been circling this whole account, the answer I gave to the last question, the one the whole grown chamber on 7 worlds had taken 3 days to be brave enough to ask. Would you do it again? I have already told the court my answer, yes, in a heartbeat, and I would weep the whole time. But I did not tell the court what came after the answer, the very last exchange, the thing that ended the proceedings, and it is the right place to end this account too, because it is the closest thing to a verdict that any of us ever received, and it came not from the chamber but from Vasari, the speaker for the wronged worlds, the bread instrument of grief that had spent 3 days trying to convict me and had broken open instead. After I said yes in a heartbeat, and I would weep the whole time, the chamber was silent for a long while, the living walls breathing slow around us, and then Vasari unfolded itself one last time and came down off its raised place and crossed the chamber floor to stand in front of me, closer than the prosecution is ever supposed to stand to the witness. And the lattice went quiet because what passed between us did not need 9 tongues. And the speaker for the wronged worlds looked at me, this small, tired human who had eaten its civilization's God and refused its civilization's comfort and put one true sentence into a record it could not edit. And it asked me one final thing, off the record, in a voice the lattice barely carried. It asked, how do you bear it? Not how did you win, not how did you survive. How do you bear it, the carrying, the weight, the unbearable thing that does not lighten? Because Vasari had spent its whole life as an instrument of grief without ever being taught how to carry the grief it instrumented, and the trial had broken it open, and now it stood in front of the one creature in the chamber who knew, and it asked the question its whole civilization had spent 9,000 years making sure it would never have to ask, the question the Concord had no answer for, the question on which its empire of fear had finally, quietly begun to fall. And I gave it Prout's answer, which was no answer, which was the only true answer there is. I said, you don't bear it, you can't bear it, it is unbearable. That is what the word means, you carry it anyway. You pick it up, and it is too heavy, and you carry it, and tomorrow it is still too heavy and you carry it again, and you do not get stronger and it does not get lighter, and one day you notice you have carried it a very long way, and that is the only thing that ever happens, and it is enough, and it is the whole of what we are. And it is the one thing your monsters could never take from us because it was never something we had. It was something we did every day forever, the way you breathe. The way the heart keeps its terrible patient time. And then I stopped talking because there was nothing left to say, and Vasari stood in front of me a moment longer, and then it folded itself down, all the way down, lower than I had ever seen it go, lower than its station, and it did a thing that no speaker for the wronged worlds had ever done in 9,000 years toward any witness of any species. It bowed, not in surrender, not in defeat, in the way you bow to someone who has shown you how to carry the thing you did not know how to carry. And the chamber watched its instrument of grief bow to the human who had eaten its God, and in that bow the whole long lie of the frontier doctrine finally, completely, came apart, and the proceedings were over, and I was free. And I had done what I came to do, which was to leave one true thing in a record that could not be edited, for the next ship of hungry, expendable people that the universe would lower into some dark on the end of a baited charter. I have circled the end of this account the way I circled the reactor bay, approaching and retreating, because there is a part of me that does not want it to be over, that knows the telling is the last thing I have left to do for the 14 of us, and that when the telling stops I will have to go back to simply carrying it without the relief of setting it into words. But the court asked me to begin at the end, and a thing that begins at the end has to be brave enough, eventually, to arrive there. So let me arrive. Before I do, the court should understand why I keep saying, the record the way I do, why I have come back to that phrase again and again across 3 days of testimony like a tongue returning to a missing tooth. It is because the record is the only thing I was ever really fighting for. Not the verdict, I did not want a verdict, would not have accepted one. Not vengeance, there was no one left to take it from. Not even justice in the end, because justice requires a target and the crime had outlived all its authors. I came to that chamber for one thing only, to put a true sentence somewhere it could not be erased, where the next hungry, expendable people would find it. Because there will be a next time. The court should not comfort itself that the fall of the frontier doctrine ended the danger. The danger is not the doctrine. The danger is the clean room, the committee, the distance, And those are not features of the Concord. They are features of anything that climbs high enough to start feeding from far enough away. My own species has them. Every species that has ever risen has them. Somewhere on some world I will never see, another comfortable people is even now looking at some younger, hungrier people and seeing cheap labor, expendable crews, viability probes, line items, and somewhere a charter is being co-signed. And a dignitary is wishing a crew a safe and fruitful journey in however many tongues, and a comm is scheduled to go dark, and a weapon, bred from someone's tortured mercy, is waiting in some dead zone to confirm that the deep law is fear. And when that crew enters that dark, hungry and switched off and written down, I want them to have what we did not have. We went in blind. We discovered the bottom of ourselves by falling all the way to it with no warning, no map, no record left by anyone who had fallen before. 4 of us did not survive the fall. But I survived it, and I climbed back out, and I went to the highest chamber in the old comfortable galaxy, and I carved one sentence into a record that cannot be edited, and the sentence is for them, the next ones, the ones not yet starving. It does not work. The worst they have does not work. You are hungrier than their monster, and you always were, and underneath the hunger is the carrying, and the carrying does not break. Hold the line. Bleed yourself clear if you have to. Stay close enough to the meat to weep. And when the thing they sent to terrify you reaches down expecting to find your fear, let it find what we found at the bottom of ourselves. 400,000 years of creatures who looked at something bigger and saw a meal, and lived. That is the record. That is what I went to the chamber to leave. Not my name, which does not matter, not my freedom, which I would have spent gladly, not even the truth about the Concord, which mattered but was never the point. The point was the next crew, the ones I will never meet, lowered into some dark on the end of a charter. And the chance, the only chance I could give them across all that distance and all that time, that they might find, waiting in the unerasable record, the knowledge that someone fell before them and lived, and that the falling has a bottom, and that the bottom holds. There is a memory I have kept back from the court through this entire account, saving it the way you save the one photograph you cannot bear to look at often, and I will give it now near the end, because the court has spent 3 days hearing about how 14 people died and 9 survived and 1 ate a god, and it has not once heard who we were before any of it, when we were just a crew, just 14 ordinary people far from home, and that is a theft I do not want to commit against my own dead. It was the night before the resupply failed. We did not know it was the night before anything. That is what makes the memory unbearable, that we were happy, ordinarily happy, in the small way of a crew at the end of a long shift, with no idea that the floor was about to drop out of the universe. Lena had found, somewhere in the agricultural deck, a way to make the protein paste taste like something other than protein paste, some trick with the hydroponic herbs, and she had made enough for everyone, and we ate it together in the galley, all 14 of us, crammed in the way you cram into the one warm room on a cold ship, and it was good, and we knew it was good, and for one night the food math was generous and no one had to do any arithmetic at all. Cho told a story that night. Cho, who would be the first through the airlock, who would pause 9 seconds in the chamber taking care of us even as he left us. That night Cho told a long, ridiculous story about a survey posting he'd had years before, some disaster of bureaucracy and malfunction that had no point except to be funny. And he told it badly, on purpose, drawing it out. And we all knew he was telling it badly on purpose, and that was the joke. And Marcus kept interrupting to talk to the ship about it, asking the Quill asterisk to corroborate, and the Okafor siblings were laughing too hard to fight about anything. And Finch, the boy, still entirely a boy that night, Finch laughed until he had to put his head down on the table. The helpless laughter of the young, who do not yet know that anything can be taken from them. Holt watched us all, the way she always watched, but that night the watching had no worry in it, just fondness, just a physician's quiet pleasure at seeing every body in her care fed and warm and laughing. Amara let the shift run long past when she should have called it, because she could see what the rest of us could only feel, that this was one of the good nights. The kind a crew gets a handful of on a long posting, the kind you do not interrupt. And Prout, old Prout, who had seen how it ends, Prout sat a little apart, the way he always did, and watched the young ones laugh, and there was something in his face that I did not understand until much later, until I had seen how it ends myself. He was memorizing us. He had been on enough postings, lost enough crews, to know that the good nights are rare and that you do not get to know in advance which one is the last, and so he had made it a practice, across a long life, to memorize the good nights while they were happening, to be the one person in the warm room who was also quietly saying goodbye just in case. I do that now. I learned it from watching Prout's face that night, though I did not know that was what I was learning. I memorize the good nights now. I am memorizing this telling, even the strange, terrible good of finally setting it all down. Prout taught me that, the same way he taught Finch to carry the weight, by doing it in front of me, without explanation, and trusting that I would understand when I needed to. 14 of us in the warm galley the night before the floor dropped out. I want the court to hold that, to set it beside the reactor bay and the eating and the trial, because all of those things are true, but this is true first. This is the thing the others happened to. 14 people who liked each other, far from home, laughing at a badly told story, fed and warm for one more night. That is what the Concord lowered into the dead zone on a baited charter. Not a viability probe. Not expendable labor. That. The court convicted no one for the loss of it because there was no one left to convict, but I am entering it in the record anyway. The warm galley and the bad story and Finch laughing with his head on the table, so that somewhere in the great carved wall of the emptied world's names there is also this, the thing that was emptied, the particular irreplaceable warmth of one crew on one good night, which is what all those names were, every one of them, before they were names on a wall. They asked me to begin at the end, because the end is the part that frightens them, and I have spent 3 days and the whole length of this account proving to them that they were right to be frightened, but wrong about what to fear. They feared the eating. They built a chamber on 7 worlds to ask about 4 minutes in a reactor bay, about hull-cutting tools and even portions and a search for salt. And I gave them the eating, all of it, withholding nothing, because the eating was never the frightening part. The frightening part was always underneath, the way it always is, the way the hunger was underneath the fear, and the carrying was underneath the hunger, and the next crew is underneath everything I did. So let me end where they told me to begin. Let me give the court back its own sentence, the one it wanted notarized into the record of 7 worlds, and let me return it changed, the way the lattice changed my words, the way the Concord changed a mercy into a monster, the way everything in this universe is changed by passing through the thing that receives it. We ate it. That is the sentence. That is the proof of survival the court wanted me to start with, the scar that proves the wound. And I have traced it all the way back now, the whole length of the scar, back through the 19 days and the reactor bay, and the 40 meters of bleeding corridor, and the 4 who walked into the dark and the 30 empty days, and the tin of protein behind the partition and the warm galley the night before, all the way back to a blue-green rock that was always running short of something, and a 400,000-year line of creatures who would not lie down. We ate it. 3 small words, and underneath them, the entire history of a species that the universe could not finish off, and that found out why on the worst night any of us ever lived. I am Nadia Frost. I was the quartermaster who decided who ate and who didn't when the numbers got mean, and the numbers got meaner than any quartermaster has ever faced, and I kept my crew alive by portioning out a god, and I will carry it forever, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, weeping the whole time. I keep a calculator on a shelf where I can see it, as the thing I will not become. I memorize the good nights now, the way Prout taught me. And when I am gone, the record will remain, unerasable in 9 tongues, waiting in the highest chamber of the old comfortable galaxy for the next hungry crew that gets lowered into the dark. This is what it will tell them. This is the whole of what I learned, the finding I leave beneath fear and beneath hunger, at the very bottom, carved where it cannot be edited. They sent their apex predator to terrify us. They had spent 9,000 years perfecting it, and it had emptied 40 worlds, and it was the deepest law their universe had ever found. And we were starving and far from home, and switched off and written down, and we looked at the most dangerous being the universe had ever produced, reaching into the back of our skulls to offer us peace. And we felt, underneath the terror, the oldest and most practical thought our species has ever had, the one that picked up the first rock at the mouth of the first cave, the one that has carried us unbroken through every dark that ever tried to swallow us. That's a lot of meat, and we were so very hungry, and there were more of us than there was of it. So we ate it, and then we went looking for salt, and then we went back to work carrying what we carried, the way we always have, the way we always will, the only apex predator the universe ever made that cannot be eaten by anything, because it has already eaten its own despair every single day for 400,000 years, and found it survivable and risen the next morning, hungry and unbroken and unafraid.